Kaboom, kapow, welcome. Merry Christmas, seasons, greetings, happy holidays, whatever it is you're supposed to say at this time of the year. Thanks for joining me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the IEA, in very festive spirits here. Well, I had to borrow this hat from the IEA, and they asked me if I could wear some sort of red and white festive stuff as well. This is the only red and white festive stuff I own, Southampton stuff. So thanks for joining us rather than watching Arsenal versus Saints tonight. We have an ultra special, ultra long programme this evening as we think through everything that's happened in 2020. We're going to be looking back over the 12 months of 2020 with a whole panoply of guests. I think we've got about 17 guests this evening, all of whom have featured on Live with Littlewood over the course of the last few months. And we're going to be asking them what the highlights, or I guess more likely lowlights, were of 2020 for them. And because it's Christmas time, Santa here needs his little helpers. And for the first half of the show, my helper is Kate Andrews, the economics correspondent of The Spectator, formerly of this parish, obviously, as our associate director, joining us from the United States of America, where you say happy holidays, Kate? Is that the appropriate terminology?
You can say whatever you'd like, really.
Okay,
happy holidays. I'll go with happy holidays. Merry Christmas is fine, too.
And how are you doing? How are you, Kate?
Yeah, fine. Happy to be back on the show.
Good. So we've asked all of our guests this evening, I'm not sure we'll get through the entire list of questions, who their kind of Scrooge of the year has been, who their odd body of the year has been. That's a reference, if you didn't know it, to the guardian angel in the James Stewart film, It's a Wonderful Life. So the good guy. What's their New Year's revolution rather than resolution? What do they want to see change? And can they find a silver lining in 2020? Kate, what did you come up with for us?
You want all of them?
Well, give me your best two, and then I'll see if we're already running out of time.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go with my hero of the year, I think, who was Lord Sumption, and the reason I've picked him is because a lot of us have been talking more and more about the infringement on our civil liberties as the year's gone on, but Jonathan Sumption was first out there at the very beginning, questioning what exactly was happening as the government was bringing in rules about who could and could not sit on a bench, and who you could and could not see. And I think that his arguments have become increasingly validated. Now, people like me who think that the first lockdown actually did make a lot of sense when we didn't know what this virus was, we didn't know who it would impact, and we didn't know how to treat it yet. Even then I was looking at him and I was thinking, well, thank goodness someone's saying it. Because
Okay, you've got the easy one. I think all 17 of our guests picked him, but you just had the good fortune to go first.
Oh, I'm so lucky then. Well, look, he deserves, maybe he is the hero of the year then, right? That's a good evidence. I think he deserves the credit for actually talking about this before we would. And then, the other one I'll pick is the silver lining for this year, Mark, because I would have never wished this upon the world, but circumstances have led us to realize what happens when the market economy stops, is shut down, and when governments take over. And as it turns out, it's an absolute disaster. The UK has seen its biggest economic contraction in 300 years. The global economy took a huge dive. Governments across the world, some have gotten bits better than others, but so much has gone wrong. And I think, there are a lot of people who are going to come out of this crisis and say, we need more government, we need more state intervention. And actually, I think it's increasingly easy to point at those people and at those sentiments and say, what on earth are you on about? This year has been the perfect example of what happens when governments take more power and less is left to the market economy. We were forced to hibernate it, to shut it down, and it's been an absolutely horrendous year. So my silver lining is we know what that looks like, and we must take away from it that we need more market competition.
Well, Kate, you've got us off to a typically cheery start for this festive programme. But I think as we go through 2020 hindsight, I don't know, I think it's going to be difficult to keep that cheeriness up, I think. But your job's to help me do that for the next 90 minutes or so. All right, Kate?
I might be the wrong person to pick, but okay, I'll try to look at the rosy
I'm likely
side.
to get into a bit of a despair. about everything. And we're going to go through month by month and trying to remember what actually happened. So much has sort of happened. The world has changed so much since the start of 2020. We've got a ton of guests and a ton of topics to get through tonight. Coming up later, we've got my first cousin, Tom Whipple, the science editor of The Times, talkRADIO's Mike Graham. I'll also be joined by the Telegraph's Maddie Grant and many, many more. We've got 17 or so guests. But I want to kick off 2020 hindsight by welcoming back to the show James Price. Absolutely great to have James with us, a former special advisor, now, of course, president of the Oxford Union, and he joins us from the President's office. Mr. President, how are you keeping?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm glad to be back.
I think the presidential election you were involved in was wrapped up and much less controversial than the one in Kate's homeland, right? All went very smoothly in comparison.
Still a few legal challenges, but I think I'm confident I've got it.
Good man, good man. And it's also a warm welcome back to my good friend, Matthew Elliott, strategist, political genius, serial entrepreneur on the political stage, of course, famous probably principally for being the chief executive of the successful Vote Leave campaign, also set up the Taxpayers Alliance. Matthew, welcome, good evening. You're looking very festive with your Christmas tree there. How are you, my friend?
Good to see you, really good, thank you.
Good, okay. So I want us to think back to January. Feels like a universe away, right? Not just 11 months away. No prizes for remembering that's formally when the UK left the European Union, started the transition period. The first 2 cases of COVID were indeed confirmed in the UK. I don't think we took much notice of it then. But for the January section, and please, none of you take this the wrong way. This is not supposed to be a commentary on our guests at all. We're calling this section Weirdos and Misfits, because it was in January, of course, that Dom Cummings set out to reform the civil service by composing basically the longest job advertisement in history, calling for weirdos and misfits to step forward. In the job description, he said candidates will not have weekday date nights. Frankly, it will be hard having a boy or girlfriend at all. Then, of course, the government has actually legislated to make it nearly impossible for single people to get a boyfriend or girlfriend at all, not just if you're working for the government or for Tom. Within 2 weeks, 35,000 people had applied. So it definitely, rang true with some people. Matthew, I want to start with you. Let's think back to January, because, of course, the Conservatives had just won the election then rather handsomely. And perhaps at that period of time, a good number of us, particular free market thinking, would have been looking forward to a pretty exciting period of reform, right? Including perhaps the Dom plan to sort of tear up Whitehall. I'm making it sound destructive rather than constructive there. But do you think there was that zeal there back in January for proper reform of Britain and the way Britain does politics? And could it be rediscovered, or has what's happened since just wiped that from the slate?
I think there definitely was that zeal back in January. And if we think back to that point, as you say, after the election, Boris gets the majority of 80. And I think a lot of that majority in the Red Wall came from people who wanted to see real change and radical change. And if at the next election, people haven't seen the country change for the better, they'll stop lending their vote to the Conservatives. So there was that push there. Then, of course, COVID intervened, so a lot of that's been derailed. But the question will be is, can they get back that zeal, that vision next year when they go through the reset? Can they say, right, okay, 2020, let's all put it behind us, but let's start 2021 afresh. This is our vision for the 2020s. This is how we want to change the UK.
And do you think Dom was basically right? Obviously, it grabbed the headlines that they wanted weirdos and misfits. Obviously, that was a headline grabber. But I guess by that, a very different type of person to enter the administration in order to shake it up. Do you think that's required, or just the standard people that we see in the Westminster Village, just with a different agenda?
I think he wanted to have revolutionaries in there. He wanted people who really wanted to change the world. Just as we had done with Brexit and Vote Leave. And he didn't want people in there who would just go in there, take the job, tread water, not do very much. They need to have that campaigning, that revolutionary spirit. And just like in 2019, when Boris got in, that was a tough time, wasn't it, to get the withdrawal agreement agreed, get Parliament to agree to having the election. Then, of course, having the election as well. You needed that campaigning spirit then. And I think they wanted to carry that on into 2020 with the same zeal and fight than in 2019.
James, are you optimistic the zeal can be rediscovered? I mean, I can remember January, I was thinking this could be a really exciting and optimistic time for the nation. And obviously 2020 hasn't panned out that way. My Times article I wrote at the start of the year was that the 2020s are going to be the best time ever to be alive. That didn't age very well. Well, there's still another 10 years to go. So, but do you think that zeal can be rediscovered, or are we just now in the pits of despair, James?
Oh yeah, no, we're not in the pits of despair. I think it will all come back good again. I mean, I was still in government in January when that Misfits and Weirdos leaflet came out, and I thought, am I not being weird or enough of a misfit? I took that one slightly personally.
But you thought the ad was directed precisely at you, yeah?
I didn't think I was given a chance to act as weirdly as I wanted in these things. But as Matthew says, everything did get derailed by this. But I think that the weaknesses in the British state have been revealed quite starkly by our response to the virus in lots of different ways. The slowness to realise the scale of it and all these sorts of things. And we may get the saving grace of the AstraZeneca vaccine being the thing that really shows the best of Britain and helps lead the world out of this. But I think that so many people will realise, A, that government as it is isn't good enough and be more accepting of quite big changes. And I think more people as well, broadly for free marketeers watching, that will spend the rest of the decade being really grateful for the liberties that we have and less likely to let government take them away.
Well, yeah, that's so good. All of you are being pretty upbeat at the moment. It's a good start to the break. It won't end that way. It won't end that way. I don't know if we've got... Actually, we may have avoided Chris Snowden this evening, but as soon as he turns up, it goes to complete gloom.
It'll be the Grinch to come in.
Back in January, were you more optimistic than now, Kate, or am I just being too buffeted by events? I mean, I remember this time last year being pretty optimistic about things. We had Brexit, which I thought was going to go well. I still do, by the way, even though it still hasn't come to a conclusion. Sajid Javid holding the Brexit 50p piece. There was another win in January, by the way, that somebody's pointed out to me. Our memes were saved. The UK government announced that it would not implement Article 13 of EU copyright law, which meant that online memes might have been under threat. Are you as optimistic now, Kate, as you were then? Or maybe you weren't very optimistic at the start of the year.
I'm not as optimistic as I was then, to be honest, but you told me I have to be positive. So if I were to look at the positive sides, we have just had a record smashing breakthrough on the vaccine front, not simply in terms of the speed, but the type of vaccine that's been created. And there's already talk about what this could mean for other illnesses. And, when you allow human creativity and ingenuity to come to the forefront, you have these successes. And in many ways, COVID has slashed so many of those barriers. And the other positive, if we're going to try to find them, is that if the UK government does want to have that spectacular economic bounce back, it's going to have to make a lot of the reforms that we've been preaching for a while. People at the IEA, other think tanks on the free market right. We know that you're going to have to further liberalize the housing market. We know you're going to have to pull back a lot of that red tape. Ideally, you're going to slash some taxes, especially the ones that fall on employers. And they do seem serious about getting the economy started again, especially the Chancellor, who is a pretty committed free marketeer. So there's still plenty of reason, I think, to think the decade can be salvaged. I just wouldn't go so far as to say it's all going to be great in a few months' time. I think next year is going to be quite long as well.
Matthew, who's been your good guy, or perhaps I should say good gal of the year? I've got a hunch I know who you're going to pick. Who's been your hero of 2020?
My hero of the year is Liz Truss. And I think that did a brilliant job as Secretary of State for Trade. And let's think back to the beginning of the year. She was fighting off two sets of enemies, if you like. There were the naysayers who were saying it'd be impossible to get the trade deals signed by the end of the transition period. She's done a brilliant job on all of that. But also there were the people within the party, I'm afraid, who were saying that she might be reshuffled out or might have to leave the government. And she's gone to right to the top of the Conhome Cabinet League table as the most popular cabinet member. So I think she's had a brilliant year and been a real hero for free trade and free markets.
And she's also managed to remain sort of colossally optimistic and upbeat throughout, right? She's seen a sort of view. What about you, James? Have you got any heroes of this year? You're not allowed to pick the ones that have already gone. It's going to get harder and harder as the programme goes on. So you can't have Truss or Lord Sumption.
I was going to say, I pity the people who are going to be last in these good ones going. I might do a really awful wishy-washy thing, like that year when Time magazine said Person of the Year, you. Because I think that the people we really should back are the millions of people like my mum and dad and everybody else who've stayed home, put their lives on hold, and put up with governments being really ineffective in all these ways. And people are realizing, of course, government's going to mess up the attempt to regulate every aspect of our lives. Of course they will. But, there's all that evidence about, as soon as we were told hand washing and all these sorts of things, the evidence was going down before lockdowns even kicked in. So I'm going to go with the great British public, and it's a total cop-out.
That's a bit of a cop-out, but you're an elected politician now yourself, James, so you've got to say these sort of things. And Matthew, I think you've also got a kind of silver lining, which I think might echo a little bit of what Kate said as well. You guys are being brilliantly upbeat and optimistic. You've cheered me up already just in a few minutes. What's your sort of 2020 silver lining, Matthew?
The silver lining, as you said, I was the founder of the Taxpayers Alliance and CEO for many, many years. And I think one of the great things about this year is it's really shown how public sector procurement can go really wrong and how it can be wasteful spending. You think back to some of the PPE that was ordered that was couldn't be used. Think back to the test and trace system that was done on an Excel spreadsheet which collapsed when it filled up. So I think it's really shown how public sector procurement needs to be looked at, and I hope some of the lessons from the this year were taken forward to make sure it's done in a much better way.
And how would you have done that? I mean, do you think we'll be able to compare and contrast when the sort of audit's in, Matthew? Obviously, there'll be a public inquiry, but there'll also be endless PhD theses and books and commentary sort of looking at this particular period. Do you think we'll be able to compare and contrast that with how procurement happened in the private sector? I always say the supermarkets, I think, were amongst my heroes, how the shelves stayed stocked pretty much 99% of things, 99% of the time. Do you think we'll get to that and contrast and people will derive that lesson, Matthew?
I think we will. And I think one of the big lessons will be the importance of transparency. And that hasn't been the case in some respects. I think there's still more to come out in terms of how the money is spent and who it went to. But I think transparency is the key in all of these things.
Okay, and James, what have you got a silver lining, or we're asking for a New Year revolution as well? That's to say something you think should change, next year. It might just be your mum and dad being even more heroic, or your adoring public being even wiser.
I think it's this point that the rest of the 2020s will be like your article says, and that people will be so desperate to get out again that we'll start throwing off the shackles of the kind of creeping puritanism that we're seeing at the moment, right? The idea of not being allowed to get in the pub. Who knew even Brits would miss it that much? And that we'll spend the rest of the years, every time some diktat comes out from some bureaucrat saying no more sugar in this drink or no more units of alcohol or any of that sort of nonsense, people are just going to tell them to go and stay inside if they want to, and the rest of us will go out and enjoy life again.
Kate, let me come back to you before I say goodbye to our first guest. Oh, by the way, I've just cheered up enormously. It's Arsenal 0, Southampton 1. Theo Walcott has finally scored a goal at the Emirates Stadium, which he barely managed for them in years. So he might end up being my hero of the year, depending how that finishes. Do you agree with James's and Matthew's sort of optimism when we read through all of the tea leaves of this and people reflect upon it, Kate, that it will mean that freedom is prized more, even though people have put up with a lot of restrictions in their lives, that they'll rediscover that sort of burning desire for human liberty inside their soul, and that will set up libertarian-leaning people like us?
Broadly speaking, yes. Although I think at the very start, there's going to need to be an extra push to restore these freedoms. I think the rise of the COVID snitches, the rise of the COVID marshals has created a society where people feel much more confident about telling on each other and about pointing fingers. And I remember, when I first went back to the office, I felt a little nervous that first week. When you go back to doing what was originally normal and it's been so long, you can feel a bit nervous. So I think that first push might have to be a big one. But yeah, of course, people want to get back to socializing and hanging out at the pub and being close to one another. It's just very human. And we've had to go against all of our instincts this year.
Yeah. James, you want to mention an intriguing bet that you were involved in 2020. How did that turn out for you? And tell our viewers what the bet was.
Well, this is for people to be ready for someone who's been on the programme a few times before, but has a different name now. That Madeline Grant, the Telegraph, and I had a bet about the results of the US election. And I thought that Joe Biden would win, and she thought that Donald Trump would win. And the bet was not money, but it was about changing our names. And so Maddie, when you get her on, will now be Madeline Mary Waluigi Grant, after the Mario character. And I signed the deed poll myself. So maybe she's my real hero for going through with the bet.
I do hope that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court took this into consideration when judging up the weight of what their judgment should have been. James and Matthew, I am going to do our optimism scores. You've been pretty optimistic. But what's your optimism score for Britain over the next couple of years? If we look to 2021 and 2022 on a scale of 0 to 10, please pick an integer. Matthew, let me start with you. How optimistic are you feeling about the next couple of years?
I'm feeling very optimistic. I think we're going to get a deal with the EU. I think that in the new year we'll be putting COVID behind us. We've got the vaccine now. I think Rishi's instincts are good, so I think he'll be a good sort of free market chancellor when it comes to the budget. And I think with all of those things, economically, we've got some great years ahead of us in this sort of post-Brexit future. So I'm still very optimistic, and I would say I'm going to give it 10. I gave it 10 last time. I still give it 10.
10, blimey. Well, I'm 10 as well, because your lovely daughter is already an avid viewer and participant in Live with Littlewood. So, I mean, the future looks absolutely amazingly bright, I would say. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you. Wishing you, Sarah, and the family a very, very Merry Christmas, and hope to catch up with you in person early in the new year, I hope, if we get our freedoms back. Bless you, Matthew. Thanks. Have a good evening. James, how about you?
I'm going to, because I know it's going to get more miserable as time goes on, I'm going to go with a 10 as well. I think, as Kate says, we're going to realise we have to rely on business, and I would suspect some kind of tax cuts. That's pretty going to be my Christmas stocking wish. I think it's all going to be marvellous. And if you come and speak at the Union next year, Mark, it'll definitely be a 10.
There you go. Like you've just absolutely eased into high office so effortlessly, James. It's a pleasure to witness. So I'm sure also with the having James over the next few months in such a high and prestigious office is also going to lead us to 10 or beyond. But James, have a very, very Merry Christmas. Good luck with your new duties. Look forward to seeing you soon. Kate, please stay with us. I'll come to your numbers and optimism at the end. But wow, what a start! Nearly as good a start as the Saints at the Emirates.
I think we can only go downhill now.
Yeah, I know. That's exactly what I'm thinking of the Southampton game, by the way. Let's move on to February. We were beginning to get to the bits of people actually sort of taking a bit of a notice about what was going on around the world, and we're going to be joined by a regular guest on this programme to help guide us through what we should make of what happened in February 2020. Of course, you might remember back then the chief of the World Health Organization, how do you pronounce his name? Ghebreyesus, is that right? Have I got that right? Patrick will be able to correct me. He claimed then our greatest enemy right now is not the coronavirus itself, it's fear, rumours and stigma, and our greatest assets are facts, reason and solidarity. That's what he said. I mean, I probably think that's true now, actually. But it wasn't an obviously sensible thing for a public health official to say. There was a sudden rise in cases, but he said that the virus can still be contained and does not amount to a pandemic. A couple of weeks before, the World Health Organization repeated the claim that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission of COVID-19, and that was known to be false at the time, but they seem to be pandering to the Chinese government and ignoring the Taiwanese. As late as February the 27th of this year, the World Health Organization claimed there did not appear to be widespread community transmission. Patrick Basham's back with us. Patrick, very good evening to you from where we are, afternoon to you where you are. Lovely to have you back on the programme. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you, sir. Good evening, good afternoon to Kate. Good to see you both. You did mention it would be downhill. Like Kate said, it would be downhill from here on in, so we begin the downhill slide.
Great. Help us on our downhill trajectory then, Patrick.
I will do my best.
You wrote a fantastic report for your Democracy Institute, which your director, COVID-19, who is to blame, on the World Health Organization's role in turning a serious public health problem into a global crisis. And you also presented a very popular film for us on our IEA London YouTube channel as well, which we'll make sure we link to in the chat. What was going wrong with these huge public health agencies, the WHO, back in February? What, right at the start, could we have taken another path that would have made things so much easier?
Yes, we could have. I mean, it all goes back to New Year's Eve 2019, when the WHO was told two things. They were told by the Chinese, Geneva, we have a problem. We have a virus and we don't know what we're going to do about it. And it looks pretty bad. And the WHO, for a couple of weeks, just sat on that. Eventually, in mid-January, the Chinese told the world that people were dying. But that was already, the horse had already bolted. Also on New Year's Eve, the Taiwanese told the WHO that there is human-to-human transmission. And the WHO sat on that and denied that that was the case until late January. And there was, talking about Southampton, University of Southampton study that came out this year that concluded that if the world had known what was going on in China 3 weeks earlier than it did, the 95% of global cases and deaths could and probably would have been prevented. So the two things happened with the WHO. They made every mistake in the book, and obviously that's a problem. But the real problem is that that's their job. I mean, their job is to prevent pandemics, to prepare the world, and then to minimize the damage should one occur.
Sure.
The second problem is that they appear to be more or less the public health spokesperson for the Chinese government. And so it was always going to be hard, perhaps mission impossible, to get this thing properly dealt with from the top down, from Geneva, so long as the Chinese were calling the shots with the WHO.
Hey, what's your take on this about the way that the public health authorities acted, either the World Health Organization or Public Health England here, as Patrick says, they seem to be involving themselves in all sorts of parts of our lives. But as Chris Snowden's report for the IEA said, which we published in November, you had one job, which essentially was to predict, deal and advise around pandemics. What's your audit, Kate, of how well or badly these guys did it?
I think it's been atrocious. As Patrick says, they had more than enough opportunities to come out and tell the rest of the world what was going on and the risk that was being put to them. And instead, they decided to side with China, and not just side with China. I mean, they covered up for China, but actively go out there in January and February and praise China, talk about how it's transparent, how they're doing a fantastic job getting the virus under control, repeating health talking points that simply, as you said, Mark, weren't true, that it was very difficult to transmit this in the community. They had one job. They're paid an incredible sum of money. It's something like $6 billion a year, I think, is the institution's income, to tackle pandemics, to give public health advice, real public health advice, not, let's push sin taxes and let's get sugar out of everything, but to really deal with serious illnesses. And China tried to cover it up. The World Organization, in my opinion, did everything it could to help them, and then defended them when others around the world, quite rightly, pointed a finger at China and said, wait a second, I think you've really messed this one up.
Patrick, what's the reckoning up look like here? So if your and Kate's analysis is right, and certainly when I first started studying your research and Chris Snowden's, I mean, it's A, persuasive, but B, jaw-droppingly bad, basically. But why is there never any reckoning up? Nobody ever seems to carry the can for this. If you make these sort of errors in the private sector, the CEO's fired or the company liquidates or some such like. The wheels just seem to keep on turning here, however grotesque the incompetence is, or even the level of corruption involved or the politicking involved, rather than focusing on the actual job, namely to, prepare for, predict, preempt pandemics. Why have no heads rolled, or are they about to?
No heads have rolled. Welcome to the world of the United Nations. Welcome to the world of international institutions that suffer from tremendous mission creep and the misuse of apparently precious financial resources, both which apply in spades to the WHO. The problem with the WHO and the problem with the argument for reform from within, which has been rejected as of this summer by the World Health Assembly, which governs the WHO, is that, as we've already touched on, the Chinese call the important shots. And the African and Latin American members, for example, of which there are many, are very much beholden to the Chinese. The leadership of the WHO is beholden to the Chinese. So there's nothing happening there. Hence the Trump administration's threat in the spring to take its $500 million and go away with it. And they gave them a couple of months to sort themselves out. WHO said there's no problems here. We're doing a fantastic job. In fact, you should give us more money. So the Trump administration said, we're going to take our money and give it elsewhere.
Yep.
And of course, if Joe Biden's inaugurated on January 20th as the next American president, he's made quite clear that $500 million is staying right where it was. That's why, for example, at the Democracy Institute, what we are talking to people about is creating a rival, trying to get the fundraising and financial and the political muscle behind a rival that actually focuses on pandemics, which is the mission of the WHO. You're not going to change an institution like this for a million reasons, and we just have to accept that we have to work around the WHO. We're not going to be able to reform it. It is certainly not going to reform itself.
So would the GOP, the Republican Party in America, be sympathetic to that idea? That you would, perhaps get the United States of America, conceivably the United Kingdom, other countries to say, look, we're not necessarily arguing about the amount of public money that's spent on pandemic prevention and preparation. We're only complaining about the institution which is being granted that money. Let's set up a different institution, same number of dollar bills on the table, but let's constitute it in such a way that it's clearly focused on its mission. That's your pitch, basically, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Our preliminary discussions have found very receptive ears. Yes, with the Trump administration, which wants to spend that $500 million on public health, but where it will actually do some good. But also elsewhere in the world. For example, in Africa, I talk about the African countries beholden to the Chinese for economic reasons, but there are a number of African countries where not only the people, but the governments themselves are a little tired of being told how high to jump by the Chinese. And although they won't say it publicly, they are would be very keen on an option in that regard. So the soil is fertile. The question is, can it be watered and seeded in time to make a difference?
Kate, what's your view of it? You've recovered from being attacked by your cat, Kate, I gather. Right? Yeah.
All is well.
So well done for overcoming that public health problem entirely on your own without government assistance.
Thanks.
What's your take on this, Kate? That we could have a very different institutional approach, a competitive institutional approach to public health, right off the WHO. Earmark the same amount of money and just say we're actually going to have the Western health, the NATO health organization or whatever it might be. It's going to focus exclusively on trying to prevent or mitigate these sort of things in future. It's not going to talk about wrappers on confectionery and banning McDonald's advertisements. Just on this, it's going to focus. We'll earmark the same money, but we'll give it to a different agency. One that I presume, I haven't asked Patrick this, but kind of the clues in the name, one that democracies are contributing to rather than communist dictatorships are controlling.
I'm not convinced that simply changing the bureaucratic institution is going to make all that much difference, although I completely appreciate that moving away from one that has become dominated by an authoritarian state is probably a good idea. As somebody who supports devolution, I think that many of these issues are usually best solved at home, and you want to get as localized as possible because one size often does not fit all. But when we are talking about something like a pandemic that's infecting every single corner of the world, for me, it's about scaling back the responsibilities of the institution. I think one of the problems with the World Health Organization is that you can point to them and they say, well, we do all these things. I don't think they do them well, but we do all of these things. Sorry if we dropped the ball on this pandemic. No, you need to be able to point to an organization and say, to Chris's paper, you had one job. This was your job. You either succeeded at mitigating the problems or you failed. So I would scale back whatever institution, whatever their responsibilities are, and I'd actually hold them accountable because I think it's become very easy for organizations to go off and do what they want, usually some kind of interventionist approach to the world, and then to take the money that was actually meant for good public health initiatives.
Patrick, do people of our inclination need to get back to a stricter definition of what public health means? It seems to have expanded to mean the health of any member of the public, whereas presumably it should actually be an agency that tackles what economists would call public good problems like pandemics, not a problem such as me eating too many hamburgers or smoking too many cigarettes, which may be bad for my health, but is a private health problem. It's a problem for me as an individual. I'm not contaminating other people if I eat 3 Big Macs a day. Do you think we need to if you were to get this new agency off the ground, or if by some miracle we were to recapture the World Health Organization for its original purpose, that we need to be stricter about what public health means as against nannying sort of state measures which are trying to control the private health of public citizens.
Absolutely, Mark. I mean, the WHO, it's illustrative, its history, its evolution is illustrative of so many health ministries around the West. The WHO has been around for 50 years. For the first 70 years, I should say. For the first 30 years, they were focused at a vertical focus. It was about pandemics. Since then, since the late 70s, it's been about health across the board. It's been a horizontal focus, right? Which means you focus on everything. You don't really focus that well on anything. That is what's happened in most of our health ministries as well. Of course, this mission creep has no end. It's infinite, because that means you can then talk about mental health, you can talk about economic health, health based on gender, and all the rest of it. These things may or may not be important, but they're not the responsibility of those institutions that were set up for a different purpose, right? So I think it's possible, one of the perverse consequences, lessons of all of this in 2020 is that enough people are catching on to the fact that not only does government generally run things poorly, but when they run things that they're not even supposed to be running, they run them abysmally poorly. So, maybe there's some hope there. There's some silver lining.
Kate, do you agree with that? Do you think we can get back to this, a definition of what public health sort of truly means, rather than its slightly, preposterous extension to mean the health of any member of the public? Do you think when we go through the public inquiry, I was saying this to a cabinet minister actually, that we should tell whatever Public Health England's successor is that if it's not about bat soup from China, I don't want to hear about it. Right? If it's not about those sort of problems, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want a single penny of your money spent on anything other than to try to preempt the next pandemic. Do you think that will come through, Kate, when we do the reckoning up, when we go through a public inquiry and reflect upon this year rather than just live through it?
I think it could come through a bit. I think the government's, move a step away from Public Health England would suggest that they do want, at least in the UK, to reassess what it means to tackle public health issues. And if we ever were going to, this is obviously the moment, because we were underprepared when COVID-19 hit. And so perhaps we should be putting more resources and emphasis on that. This is our shot to do it. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of people go into government, they go into the bureaucracy because they have their ideas about how they want others to live, and very few people want them to live more freely. So I'll believe it when I see it. But yeah, this is the moment to do so, and perhaps this is the time where we have the strongest arguments to make the case.
Patrick, before I say goodbye to you and bring in some more of our galaxy of guests, perhaps you could tell us who your Scrooge of the year was and what your New Year's revolution suggestion is, which I think touches on the issue we've just been discussing, and then also your optimism rating that you'll be familiar with out of 10 for the next couple of years or so for the West, where 10 is libertarian utopia has been achieved, and 0 is we have become North Korea with the World Health Organization controlling our every move. Okay.
My Scrooge of the year is Nancy Pelosi, current Speaker of the US House. Dragged her feet on the stimulus bill early in the first one in the year, because rather than simply give checks to people who'd been forced by the government to not work and couldn't pay the rent or the mortgage, she wanted the laundry list, got most of the laundry list, the wish list of Democrats before she would agree to it. And now, still, for months, she hasn't let those second checks go out because, again, there's another wish list that had to be added, which wasn't. So she's my Scrooge of the year. In terms of New Year's revolution, was that the second one, Mark?
Yeah, your New Year's resolution / revolution. Bit of a play on words. What's the revolution you want to see next year?
Yeah, I mean,
it's resolution to have a revolution.
Further to our discussion already, I mean, it's to double down on the anti-nanny state campaign for the reasons we've already touched on. And I do think that we're at a point where we may be approaching a critical mass, which is always essential to actually change things. I think there are enough regular people out there who are pissed off enough and who recognize that the government is just crazily involved in intervening everywhere, mostly with catastrophic consequences. So I think there is the there's a potentially receptive public out there across most Western countries. In terms of a score, medium term, I think we could be at, say, a 7 or an 8. In the short term, though, I think it's a 2 or a 3. I think we are much nearer that critical mass, but I think things still have to get worse, and I sadly think they will over the next couple of years before, please God, we turn a corner.
So I always ask people for one integer, Patrick. You gave me 4. Does that average out at a 5 then, roughly?
Well, okay. Let's be centrist about it and say it's a 5.
A 5. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us on so many editions of Live with Littlewood. Look forward to catching up with you and having you back on in the new year. Have a very, very Merry Christmas, my friend. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mark. Merry Christmas, everyone.
So we're moving into March now. I'm trying to keep up, trying to make sure we get through all 12 months of the year before I finish the 3 cans of beer in front of me. Lockdown begins. Right, this is where things you might think start to get a bit bleak. We spiral from a country that apparently valued freedom in its soul to putting tape around logs to stop people sitting on them, that kind of stuff. Steve Davies' film going viral on the history and economics of pandemics became very popular as people tried to understand how they, what the history was and what these sort of impacts of pandemics were on our normal working lives. And lockdown begins initially, bear in mind, for a period of 3 weeks. That was the concept. Well, we've got 2 new guests on to share their thoughts and reflections on March 2020. So I hope they're joining us now. We've got talkRADIO's Mike Graham is with us, and Spike's Brendan O'Neill, regulars both on the programme. Gentlemen, fantastic to have you with us. Brendan, good evening. Mike, Hello. Good evening. Thanks very much for joining us. Brendan, let me start with you. Ronald Reagan was right, wasn't he? There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government programme.
I think we may soon find out. I mean, I think the thing that worries me most about the lockdown has been the way it's just stretched from March right through to the end of the year. I mean, we've just been going in and out of lockdown constantly. And the thing that worries me going into 2021, of course, and this is where Reagan could well be right, you know, it's very easy for a government to take away our freedoms. It's much harder for us to get them back. And we know from history that when governments accrue a certain amount of power, they're often very reluctant to relinquish that when time is up. And I don't think Boris Johnson's government is going to be any different on that front. I think some people in positions of power relish the authority they have assumed over our lives, and getting it back from them is going to be a tall order over the next year.
Mike, do you think that's true? A good evening to you, Mike. I mean, these were sort of brought in as, well, it's going to be 3 weeks of sort of having to sort of change your social life a bit. And, you know, here we are at the end of the year and it's become a permanent feature of our lives, hasn't it? I mean, all of this was rushed through Parliament in 20 minutes flat, near as goddamn damn it. And it's still with us, you know, 9 months on.
Yeah, I remember walking out of a place called the Telephone Exchange opposite News UK's building in London Bridge on March the 18th or whatever it was. And like you, I thought, well, 3 weeks, it'll be all right. You know, we'll manage to probably hunker down and, you know, make more spaghetti bolognese than we normally do. And then here we all are watching the press briefing today. I was horrified to see all these bozos from the main BBC, ITV and Sky broadcasting companies saying, can you please tell us what to do? Because we don't know. You know, what do you mean? Is it either, you know, guidelines? Is it the law? You know, how many people can we have for dinner? I mean, the guy from ITN actually said, I think, and I put a tweet out saying, is this the only bloke in Britain who thinks that every single family is going to be joined by 3 other families and they're all going to sit there for 5 days in some kind of bacchanalian fest where they're all going to sort of end up like Le Grand Bouffe bursting because they've eaten so much? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, I was old enough to be in the Reagan White House when he was actually president, right? And he used to describe America as the shining sepulchre on the hill. Well, you know, they basically shut all the lights out on the shining sepulchre on the hill and they've shut the road.
Kate, is that what it feels like? You're recently back in the United States of America. Are you still the shining city on the hill, or are you just, you know, the grim, you know, worn down, trampled down dumpster fire on the hill?
I'm inclined to think we're heading that way now that Donald Trump isn't going to be president of the United States, but I know from a previous podcast with Brendan that he highly disagrees with me on that. So he might have a different take. I think the difficult thing for the UK is that it has never really tried personal responsibility in the wake of this pandemic, is that it didn't, I think people showed it hugely back in March when the public decided to go home, the public adopted new hygiene standards, the public stopped socializing long before they were legally told to do so. But very quickly, the government brought in laws and rules for which you could be fined, for which you could even be taken to court. And now all of a sudden it's leading up to Christmas and they're now talking about personal responsibility. And I've always thought that the British public is very capable of this, but we haven't really bothered to try it. And I think the impact of telling people exactly what they can do at any given time is going to have big ramifications. I'm very hopeful that people are going to want to re-embrace their freedoms come next year. But as I was saying before, I think it's going to take an extra special push because a lot of people are going to be made very nervous by the attempts this year basically to completely enclose us in private spaces. So I'm very hopeful, but I do think it's going to take some effort.
Brendan, I want to come back to you on whether you think there's the beginning of a fight back or just a sort of shrug of the shoulders from ordinary British folk. And I guess it's not a binary question. You know, people might tolerate it for a while, but gradually impatience can build up and they start to think that the cure is worse than the disease. I've got some brilliant, these are the best excuses we could find for breaching lockdown. Heroes, all of them. I've been to buy nail clippers for the dog. My son is a rubbish cook, so I take him food every day. I'm sorry, I don't watch the news. What's going on? That's a particular favourite of mine. I'm taking my mate into Newport to buy drugs. Good a reason as any to go into Newport, I guess. Or I'm jet skiing to the Isle of Man to visit my girlfriend. That's a pretty romantic one. But Brendan, do you think that the people are beginning to get either worn down by this or irritated about it, or beginning to say, look, I'm just going to have to start taking my life into my own hands now and, you know, sort of to some degree damn the consequences. I'll act responsibly myself. But as Mike was saying, these government strictures now, even if you wanted to follow them, you need a PhD in law and hygiene to work out what they're going on about.
I think that's the million-dollar question in a way, what people are going to do about the lockdown. I mean, someone has to do something because our governments are just spiraling into lockdown after lockdown, even though there is very little evidence that they work. I mean, if you look at the fire break or firewall, whatever it was called in Wales, I mean, it was disastrous. It just didn't work. Cases are going up again really, really fast. And what does the Welsh First Minister say? He says we're going to have another lockdown to sort out the problems that were caused by the last lockdown. I mean, they have no solutions. So we do need a push from somewhere. Ideally, it should come from the public. I think what's happened this year is lots of people have broken the rules in a very sensible way. I think most people are being quite cautious. They're not hugging old people in the streets or any of that kind of stuff. I think they're being cautious, but they are breaking the rules and bending the rules in order to live their lives. The problem is, I think that's a fine thing to do. The problem is that there is very little public expression of that willingness to dissent. So if you look at opinion polls, they're really interesting. There was one early on in the year, maybe around April, which asked people, are you breaking the rules? And they all said no. But when they were asked the same question anonymously with a guarantee that there would be no way of discovering who said it or where that person lives, loads and loads of people said yes. I think that reveals how intolerant and censorious the discussion this year has become, because anyone who criticizes lockdown runs the risk of being called a granny killer and evil and narcissistic and doesn't care about anyone else. So there's been a real culture of censorship. It's really brought home to me the fact that freedom of speech and freedom of thought are even more important in a crisis rather than less important. I think that's what people get wrong. They say, oh God, this is a terrible virus. It's quite dangerous. It's very contagious. Therefore, we have to crush dissent. I take the opposite view. It's precisely when society faces risks and we all have to contribute to the discussion about how to deal with them. It's precisely in that moment we need the fullest freedom of speech possible.
Well put. Mike, as in the Republic of Mike Graham and as a radio presenter, what's your sense of the mood of the British public and your listeners? Are they phlegmatic about this? Are they incensed? As Brendan says, is there a danger that they're saying to the opinion polls, oh yes, everything must be done because they just want to get Ipsos Mori off the phone, but then actually are living their own lives independently? What's your sense of your pulse of the nation and ordinary Joe? Where does ordinary Joe stand on all of this now, do you think, Mike?
Well, first of all, including the audience that I have and the people that I've ever spoken to in my entire life, I've never yet met anyone who's ever been polled. I mean, I know you guys work in the think tank arena, and maybe you know people that do actually get a phone call from Ipsos Mori or YouGov once in a while, and they contribute to it. I think what's very clear is we have a lot of what I regard as ordinary people who run businesses, people who run pubs, people who run hotels, people who run restaurants, people who run, event companies who haven't been able to make any money at all for most of the year. And these people are absolutely horrified. They're the backbone of Britain, the small businesses that keep this country going, not the huge conglomerates that don't pay any tax because they can somehow get away with it, because they schmooze the government and give them a few jobs after they get kicked out of the House of Commons. And in the end, the people, I think, are fed up to the back teeth of what is a dithering and pretty useless government, which started off by saying, this is the most deadly disease that's been known to man, but we can't really tell you how it's dangerous because we can't measure it and we can't test anybody because we haven't got the wherewithal. We're going to put a lot of people's lives at risk because we haven't got the right equipment. Now that we are testing loads of people, we're going to tell you that, in fact, there's many more infections now than there were before. People just don't believe a word that the government says now, right? So this idea that the idiotic sort of what I call the idiotic upper middle class media people who are telling everyone that we must lock down even more because they've got a nice big house in Putney, they're not buying it. And I think Brendan's absolutely right. Most people, most ordinary working people, have been bending the rules when they see it fit to do so, because that's what they need to do. Some of them are doing it because they absolutely have to make some money.
Brendan, I know you've got to leave us in the next minute or two, so let me come to your optimism rating. I don't know if you want to give us either your bad guy or good guy of the year as well, but what's your optimism rating for the next year or two, where we stand in this Christmas period, looking forward for 24 months on a scale of 0 to 10?
I'm a natural optimist. I know I often don't sound like one because I spend my life moaning about things, but I am quite optimistic. I'm especially optimistic now. I'm even optimistic about the American election. As Kate was saying, she and I were on rather different sides of that. But let's remember, Donald Trump got the second largest vote in the history of the American Republic. Biden, of course, got the largest ever vote in the history of the American Republic. So there are still tens of millions of people in the US and in the UK and around the world who don't like the technocratic drift of politics, don't like woke politics and want something different. I think that's quite inspiring. So my optimism would probably be around a 7 or an 8.
Pick one.
7 today. And then in relation to good guys and bad guys, there are too many bad guys to choose from, too many Scrooges. I think Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, is probably my choice because I think he's nuts. He has no clue how to run a society, and he's ruining many Welsh businesses and people's lives. And he's been, I think, incredibly destructive in that country. And
a word of health advice, practical advice for people: if you're worried about the electrics in your home, don't get him round to bring about a circuit breaker. Probably not going to work out well for you guys.
Don't do that. And then finally, my hero of the year has got to be Samuel Paty, the French school teacher who was executed essentially for the crime of teaching children about freedom of speech. I think he was an incredibly brave person. I think everyone across the Western world should celebrate him, and I think he is my hero of the year, the good guy of the year.
Wow, and in a tragic story, but a very good guy. Brendan, thanks for joining us. Do run if you have to. I think I've just about got you off on time. Have a very Merry Christmas, Brendan. I look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks.
Mike, what about your list? Who's your Scrooge of the year?
Well, I missed the absolute start of your show, and I heard with some trepidation that you were looking forward to making it more and more difficult for people to come up with people's names.
I've got good news for you, Mike. Nobody's picked yours yet, amazingly. So you can still go with your first choice.
Well, Matt Hancock is my Scrooge of the year because this is a bloke who you literally would not buy a used car from. You look at him and you just think, why, first of all, and I know that it's not very fashionable to criticise people for their dress sense, but why is he always wearing a pink tie and that ridiculous NHS badge, as if I'm wearing this badge because the NHS is the greatest organisation that ever lived. NHS, right, for all of the great people that work in it, is an incredibly inefficient organisation. If it was in the private sector, it would have gone under about 20 years ago, because the amount of waste that goes on there, the amount of idiocy in the management is incredible. So Matt Hancock, because he's the man who coined the phrase, "you don't want to kill your granny," thereby proving that he's a complete and utter moron when it comes to the way people feel about their grannies. Second of all, this is the same guy who said he was an expert in all things to do with picking the winner of something, because he comes from Newmarket and he knows about horses and he always backs both of them. And you go, well, actually, that's not what you do when you go horse racing. You don't actually back all the horses in the race, because that, the bookies have worked out, won't make you any money.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, but he hasn't really placed much of an each way bet here, has he, Mike? I mean, he's put everything on protect the NHS. The only thing that matters to him is a moving series of statistics, the infection rate,
which are mostly
protect
wrong,
the NHS, all of that stuff, you know.
Yeah, and most of the stats are actually wrong. You know, we've got a test and trace system that doesn't test or trace. We've got a vaccine system that you can't get depending on which part of the country you live in. We've got a test and release system that's only been rolled out to 11 counties of the country. I've got a friend of mine in Kent whose daughter's coming back from Amsterdam, and she wants to spend Christmas with her mother, but they've given her a test opportunity in Scotland. And you go, well, that doesn't work. You know, the hospital beds have not been overrun. Everything they said would happen hasn't happened. I mean, apart from that, he's doing great.
But that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's all around a climate of fear, basically. Yeah. All of the sort of protect the NHS stuff has all been around. I mean, everybody's now said it. I thought the NHS was there to protect me, not the other way around. I thought that's what my taxes went on. I didn't realise I paid them tax, and then I had to protect them in my spare time as well.
I was saying this the other day on a podcast I was doing. It's a bit like saying to the fire brigade, you know, don't come around if my house is on fire in case you get overwhelmed. You know, because obviously that's your job. But we don't want you doing it just in case there's another fire and you won't be able to get to that one. So just don't come to ours and just let us all burn to death. Yeah. You know, it's kind of it's the policies of madness. It really is.
And so, Mike, before I let you go, what's your optimism score out of 10? So just to remind you of the definition, just looking 2 or 3 years ahead. 10 would be Britain is a wonderfully free and prosperous country in 2 to 3 years' time. 0 is we're North Korea. Pick an integer between 0 and 10. What's your feeling and why?
I'm a bit like Brendan, actually. I'm a very optimistic individual, and notwithstanding the uselessness of the government, I'm looking forward to an 8, I'm going to say, because I'm going to be eating a lot more fish that the Spanish aren't going to be allowed to catch. I'm going to be eating a great deal more steak because the eco-planks are going to lose the battle to change everything into green energy. And I'm not going to be driving an electric car because at some point the government's going to work out that actually killing young people in Africa in order to mine lithium is actually not a very nice thing to do.
And just before I let you go, my producer here, Mike's just said, I've got to ask you a question. I've just seen on the list, your silver lining for 2020 was Harry and Meghan.
Harry and Meghan,
what,
yes.
WTF? How's that a silver lining?
Well,
tell me.
I mean, you might not remember this all this long time ago, but it was only last year that they moved to America, right? And they moved to America with one sort of aim in mind, and that was to entertain a lot of us during this terrible lockdown that we've had to sit through. Because not only have they allowed us to make fun of them from 1 week to the next, they're now going to glorify us with their podcast. They're going to give us a new Netflix series about how great it is to be rich and privileged while caring about the underprivileged and doing nothing about it. They've just been a great source of amusement for me. And so I think that as a royal watcher, they've just been very, very entertaining. So they're my silver lining.
Brilliant. And it just shows in Brexit Britain, our export business is already firmly underway, right? Exactly. I mean, a pretty good start in Brexit Britain. Mike, lovely to have your company again. Keep flying the flag. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Look forward to speaking again in the new year. Take care, my friend.
Thank you.
Just before I bring in my next guest, you've been one of the most prolific writers and commentators on healthcare reform in the United Kingdom. The amount of abuse and toxicity that's been thrown at you for even raising questions and engaging in a serious and logical debate about it has been vicious, absolutely horrific. But do you think coming out of this, in sharp contrast to all the sort of flag waving and clapping on the doorstep, that actually your rather calm approach to, are you sure this is the envy of the world and the best in the world, might actually begin to get a sensible and fair hearing in public debate? Or is this, I think it was Nigel Rawson who said, this is essentially Britain's national religion, criticising the National Health Service is more treasonous than being rude to the Queen?
I'm in two minds. I think we're going to come out of this pandemic with a sky-high appreciation and recognition for healthcare workers, quite rightly too. So the question is whether or not the NHS and the healthcare workers that actually showed up and took care of the sick and put themselves at risk are going to be conflated even more. I can see a scenario where they are, but I can also see a scenario where perhaps they're not. I think it's going to be a lot harder for politicians to go around talking about how great the NHS is when we have now millions of people on waiting lists who were denied healthcare this year. It's going to be harder to talk about how fantastic the NHS is, and why it's going to be harder to skirt over the cancer deaths and the stroke deaths and the heart attack deaths, because what we learned this year is that all of the people who get sick, even if we know them or we don't, we care about them now. We stayed home because we care about those who are sick that we might never even come into contact with. So I'm in two minds. I suspect, unfortunately, Mark, that the NHS will always win out. And by that, I don't mean the healthcare workers. I mean the logo and the way that politicians use it. But you told, again, at the beginning of this, you told me to be optimistic. So
yeah. You're diverting from the original script here.
Yeah, this is the year that we get NHS reform. Sure, okay. Let's pretend that's the case.
Well, let's move on to the month of April then, and let's be joined by another crusader around healthcare reform, somebody who you've been going into the jungle shoulder to shoulder with, actually. Kate Christian Niemitz, our head of political economy here at the IEA. We're calling this section about April Fools. April Fools, we're calling it, because by now, really, the lockdown really has bitten in. We're living behind some sort of version of the Iron Curtain. We're increasingly suspicious of our neighbours. Curtains are twitching. We've got to dob people into the government. We're wondering when lockdown will ever end. Ultimately, the first lockdown ended after 15 weeks, not the initial 3 that were intended. The shortcomings, if you looked hard enough, and you didn't have to look that hard, of the NHS, not to mention Public Health England, were becoming apparent. The first Nightingale Hospital opened in London, but this and many others at the cost of, I think, over £200 million have not been proved to have any particular use. Christian, welcome to you. You're joining us from your beer cellar there, I can see. From
I wish. This is all make-believe.
Oh, well, it's
But the beer is real.
To you, it's real, and to us as well. Okay, is the beer real, or was that green screened in as well?
No, that's the only thing that's real here.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start with a kind of quiz question for you, Christian. Do you know how many patients the London Nightingale Hospital has treated? It was designed to accommodate 500 patients and receive and discharge up to 150 patients every day.
Was it a couple of dozen, or was that the one with 0?
54 is the answer. And how many people has the 2,000-bed Birmingham Nightingale Hospital treated?
About in that ballpark, I guess.
0. Naught. Now, I mean, it might be a bit unkind. These were sort of bought in as insurance policies. But Christian, can I ask you this question about healthcare reform? You've written one of the seminal IEA texts on this, Universal Healthcare Without the NHS, which has been our kind of go-to book for all public debates about this, really showing that really right across the Western world, possible exception of the United States of America, there's universal healthcare, but they have very different healthcare systems to the UK, and those systems appear to perform better. I know you're undertaking research for us at the IEA at the moment, trying to compare and contrast how different healthcare systems have coped with the coronavirus. Without wanting to break the embargo on that research, what are your sort of early findings or feelings about how different healthcare systems have coped with this particular challenge?
Well, pretty much any system would have been better than the one we have. And that hasn't really registered. There hasn't been much debate about that. In the beginning, in March and April, yes, there was initially a bit of curiosity in the media about other systems. There was some registration of the fact that some seem to be doing a lot better, but then that's faded away fairly quickly. And now that we have a lot more data, nobody is talking about that anymore, especially the fact that we had the second highest excess death rate in the developed world. This should be all over the news. Only Spain did worse in that regard. We were about on a par with Italy, and below everyone and worse than everyone else in that respect. And it hasn't had much impact.
Kate, you've been writing about these issues a lot for the Spectator. I think you've even visited some other jurisdictions when the law has allowed you. Do you think we can draw any conclusions about how different jurisdictions have reacted to this problem? Because obviously you've got to filter out lots of different things. It's not just about the healthcare system. It's about density of population and cultural practices. The joke that's going round and round and round, which I'm not sure is totally true, is that the Swedes conduct social distancing as a matter of course, not as a matter of law. But how have you approached this in your role as the economics correspondent at the Spectator? And do you have any early findings for us?
Yeah, I suspect it is still too early to know the real specifics behind which operations were cancelled and which weren't. But when I was in Sweden in October, I spoke to Johan Norberg, and I put that question to him. I said, did healthcare capacity in Sweden hold up? Did you have to cancel operations? And he said there was some of that, but there wasn't loads of it. And that it does seem, anecdotally anyway, that the UK has taken it much further. Now, I think it's very notable that the NHS started pushing back on this. The NHS essentially came up with its own campaign to get people back into hospital, because if you are a doctor or a nurse and you don't have patients, you're deeply concerned about where they are and what's happening to them without you. So I actually give, again, a lot of credit to the people on the front line who are the ones who say, yes, we are here working for you. But it was the government's decision at the beginning of this crisis to kick out those who, in my opinion, are not elective care or elective surgery, but really shouldn't have had their operations and their surgeries put off. Now, I appreciate we were all concerned about capacity. That was a very, very legitimate concern for about 6 weeks. And then it became clear that it had fallen off a cliff, that we weren't going to need all that capacity. And still, it took months to get people back into hospital. This is what an inquiry is going to look into. And you can expect, certainly in developed democracies, that inquiries are going to be carried out across all of them to see how they handled the crisis. And I think that's where we'll get a lot of this data.
Christian, in terms of breaking all that down, when we're comparing different health models and how they've coped, there's a danger, isn't there, that we just look at COVID-19, whereas hypothetically you could imagine a healthcare system, I guess conceptually, that sort of nobody's died of COVID-19, but unfortunately we've cancelled all cancer treatment, we've cancelled all checkups, we've stopped dispensing drugs for any other illness, so the death rate overall could be colossally higher, even if your COVID-19 numbers were relatively better, or even hypothetically zero. How are you going to try and compare and contrast, if you like, the overall round of healthcare in general? Because surely one of the problems might be an overemphasis on one particular condition as opposed to others. If you put all of your eggs in the cracked COVID-19 basket, it might be that you haven't given enough focus. I mean, I think as the point Kate was making, I can't remember the numbers now, but the backlog on things like breast cancer screening in the UK are colossal. I don't know what they are necessarily in places that might have dealt with the particular pandemic better, but has that been at the expense of chemotherapy treatment or accident and emergency not operating as efficiently or whatever? How do we look at it in the round?
Well, you said you could hypothetically imagine a healthcare system that drops everything else, does just COVID. I would say that isn't so hypothetical. That is more or less the system that we have. And we see this from the fact that, for example, waiting times for elective surgery have gone up from something like 8 weeks in the beginning of the year to over 20 weeks, so about around half a year by summer. And this shows you how most conventional healthcare has just been crowded out. And that's why I don't see the argument that the NHS hasn't been overwhelmed as a big success. Yes, it hasn't been overwhelmed, but that's simply because it has dropped almost everything else. And that's not really the way you should deal with a pandemic. That's cheating, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
The way you would look at this is simply by looking at the excess mortality rate. You look at how many people are dying, and you compare that to what you would expect in a normal year. So you take the average of the last couple of years and maybe try to correct for some specific factors of this year, and then you see whether there is a big difference. And because in that way you capture not just the COVID deaths, but also the crowding out of conventional healthcare. If people can't get cancer diagnosis or anything else, and that would show up in the excess mortality rate. If you have a lot more people dying than would normally die at that time of the year, then that shows you the failure of the healthcare system. And on that measure in particular, this is where we're doing particularly badly. Second highest in the developed world, as I said, only Spain doing worse. In some places, especially in Asia, but also some parts of the continent, you can barely see anything in excess deaths. So there are countries where 2020 has been almost a normal year health-wise.
Well, I've focused obviously a lot on the NHS in April, but we're trying to do this month by month. It was also the month that Boris Johnson was admitted to intensive care, of course. I was actually surprised about how personally upset I felt about it. I mean, I don't know Boris Johnson at all well. But fortunately, he survived. He's returned to work. A lot of people have speculated that he might have long COVID. But Kate, do you think his freedom-loving tendencies died in that hospital, even if he walked out alive?
I don't think they died. You can you can speculate the action since then that he certainly became terrified of this virus, and who could blame him on the personal level given what he experienced? I agree with you, Mark. I thought that was one of the scariest moments of the pandemic, just for the implications of what the Prime Minister being in the ICU meant. However, I think he hates this. I mean, it was very noticeable a few weeks ago when the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was discussing the future of face masks and the future of hand sanitizer and what that could look like, and speaking about them in rather glowing terms, saying, oh, this could be with us. They've had great impacts for other illnesses. And the Prime Minister, who very rarely pushes back on his officials, especially in these press conferences, and usually leaves the science and the medicine to them, said, wait a second. He said, I'm not so sure about that. Let's see. And I think the Prime Minister is actually rather desperate to get back to what things were like before. I don't think it's in his character, his instincts to want to stop us from socializing, stop us from being at the pubs, stop boyfriends and girlfriends from seeing each other. I don't think this is in his DNA. So I'm actually a little bit of an optimist here. I think if we are going to get back to normal sooner rather than later, it's probably Boris Johnson who I would want leading that charge, because I think he, to this day, despite his experience and despite how cautious the government has become, is still probably the most pro-liberty, certainly in Downing Street, compared to anybody else right now who could realistically be in his shoes.
Christian, I suspect your view of elected politicians is rather less flattering than Kate's. Do you think that we had a freedom-loving Prime Minister who's now perhaps less freedom-loving, or were you sceptical from the outset?
Well, as you would expect, I was skeptical right from the outset, but there was certainly a change after that hospital episode, and it was particularly in the sense that he was doubling down on the signaling of his pro-NHS credentials. From then on, when he was tweeting about the NHS, he sounded like a momentum activist. I think the NHS was the beating heart of this country, and it's powered by love and all that sort of rhetoric. And okay, I can understand that he was grateful, particularly to the medical staff that was treating him, but he could have drawn a rather different conclusion. He could have said, right, it worked well for me, but then it would. I'm the Prime Minister. Of course, they pay extra attention to me, but most people don't get the prime ministerial treatment. And looking around, looking at death rates across the developed world, why are we doing so much worse? That is something. That is the sort of question that he could have asked.
Kate, what's your response to that? Do you think, again, it goes back to this NHS thing, that all politicians of whatever stripe or colour seem to fall back on that, and it's kind of an intrinsically collectivist, socialist, state-run thing of rather than a more sober reflection on what's actually happening? Has Christian got a point there?
Christian always has a point, but I almost wonder if we're being slightly too generous to the Prime Minister. I remember writing last year articles about why Boris Johnson shouldn't be throwing more money at the NHS as it remained unreformed and as that money was going to be unaccountable. This is a politician who has never been fearful about using the NHS. Frankly, none of them have, but Boris Johnson is no exception to that. I think they realized at the height of lockdown that using the NHS worked. A lot of people, got nervous about the idea of it being overwhelmed. They do have an emotional soft spot for it, and he was ready to use it like everyone else. I do think he is a politician who has always had personal experience mean quite a lot to him. So I think his experience in the ICU absolutely has shaped his policies since. But the further we get away from that, and also the more difficult it is to get people to comply, some of this data coming out about the people who are quarantining when they're told to do so, it's really rather catastrophic. That one of the few policies that we know can really help stop the spread of this virus, people aren't listening to. As it gets tougher to restrict people's freedoms, I'm just slightly inclined to think that this prime minister, compared to who else we could have, will be sympathetic to that. And he won't want people breaking the law, but he'll simply be sympathetic to the fact that this has to end sooner rather than later.
Okay, Christian, before I let you go, I need your optimism live with Littlewood optimism barometer number to remind you of the definition of that. I need an integer between 0 and 10, and it's to measure your optimism about the UK over a 2 to 3 year time horizon. 10 is classical liberal utopia has been achieved. 0 is that we're North Korea. Where are you on that scale and why?
That's got to be a 4. One of the few things that I've been, I think, consistently more optimistic about than most other people who normally appear on the show is that I do think that things will go back to normal fairly quickly. I don't believe that in this particular case, the government has an interest in holding on to the powers it acquired. I think that, of course, this has happened often in the past, but that was always when there was an ideological underpinning. Whereas in this case, there is no particular ideological school of thought that says we should lock down the population forever, or we should permanently subsidize the wages of people who can't go to work. In this case, it just lacks that ideological drive that was there on previous occasions when governments have acquired power during a time of emergency and then kept them indefinitely. So in that case, for that reason, I think we will go back to normal over the course of the next year. But liberalizing further from there, I can't see any appetite for that. So I don't think we will be North Korea, but I can't see a reason why we should move closer to liberal utopia. So 4.
A 4. Christian, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for all of your work for the IEA this year. Cast a slightly pessimistic note. I told you the programme would get more pessimistic, and it has. Arsenal have equalised against Southampton. Everything's going from good to bad to no doubt worse before the end of the match. But Christian, have a very Merry Christmas. Lovely having you on the show. See you before too long. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Kate, stay with us. We're going to move on to the month of May now, and we're joined by the IEA's Len Shackleton, editorial and research fellow here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. A very, very good evening to you, Len. We're calling this month The Only Way Is Up, or as I say, I'm not so sure that's what's really going to happen. The days are getting longer, I guess, in May. We're adapting. The UK economy is adapting to lockdown. The economy grows a bit in May by 1.8%, albeit after a 20% slump in April. Hardly a V-shaped recovery, but some sort of recovery. Little did we know. Len, good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Just how bad has lockdown been economically, and what's the recovery look like, or isn't there even one yet?
I think it's been very bad. I think it's masked at the moment. I mean, we've still got arguably about 3 million people on furlough. Whole sectors are closed down. The government's priorities just seem to be COVID and nothing else, but clearly that's got to change. I'm not as optimistic as some people really about this. I know other people around like Julian and to some extent Christian and Kate are optimistic, but I see a long struggle ahead to get back to anything like a full employment economy. So I'm a bit down at the moment.
You've recently written for us a paper on self-employment, being your own boss, should the government care. tell us about that. What did you investigate there, and what conclusions did you reach, or recommendations did you reach?
A lot of the attention has been on sort of young people in jobs in central London, closed down bars, restaurants, that kind of thing. But I've been particularly focused on the self-employed recently, because their numbers have fallen much more sharply than those of those who are employees. And although the government has coughed up some money through the self-employment scheme, it seems that over half of the self-employed have not been able to actually access that, and they're in a pretty bad way. Yet at the same time, we've got lots of pressure to sort of increase taxes on them, increase national insurance contributions. Rishi Sunak has spoken about this recently. Other people want to sort of treat them as some kind of independent contractors with a different regime, more regulation and so forth. I think if you're self-employed at the moment, in many sectors, you're pretty desperate. And I think more should be heard about self.
And so what's your prescription, Len, other than the kind of Hippocratic oath of please Rishi Sunak, do no more harm? I mean, do you think over the medium term, this should be a sector where virtually everybody's their own boss? Being your own boss is the title of your publication.
Yeah, well, there are tendencies which may lead to increasing self-employment, but our government seems determined to stamp on them. I mean, only this week they've launched a consultation on increasing VAT on so-called sharing economy jobs, which means essentially things like Uber and Deliveroo and so forth. This will be another hit to people in this sector. So the government really ought to think what it's doing about this. The self-employed we had before the pandemic started, we had 5 million of them. We've lost over 400,000 in the last 9 months, and we really ought to be thinking about that.
Kate, you're the economics correspondent of The Spectator, fantastic publication. What's been your audit for your readers about the economic impact of all of this?
Well, perhaps I'm somewhere in between Julian Jessup and Len.
Just for our viewers, what in terms of Julian's relatively phlegmatic and optimistic, right? And
yeah, so I mean, I've always been extremely skeptical of a V-shaped recovery, because I think by the time you got to June, and the great news was that you could socialize. Can't even remember what it was now, but I think the guidance was up to 30. No, legally it was up to 30. The guidance was 6 or 8, and I just thought to myself, well, this isn't exactly like the big comeback that's going to produce that V. And there were still so many restrictions on social distancing that I just thought, there's no way. And then when it became clear that governments were open-minded to circuit breakers and lockdowns, I mean, that inevitably creates an economic contraction again. So we're not coming out of this year with a V, but a wonky shaped W. I do think the vaccine, if this can be rolled out in an efficient and timely manner, has huge potential to really see a boom as early as next year. Economic forecasts are predictions. They're not necessarily going to come true, but if we take them for what they are now, that would imply that we're not getting back to pre-COVID GDP levels until towards the end of 2022, maybe with the vaccine early 2022. That's going to be painful for many, many years. Unemployment's not going to peak until next year, and that's going to be very painful as well. I think there's lots of positive indicators if the vaccine is rolled out properly, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, because we have a lot to compensate for next year, and it's going to be quite confusing to people when we're talking about how the economy can get started again, and you have something like 7.58% unemployment. We need to be sensitive, and we need to be aware of the problems that are going to exist for many years because of what we've done in this 1 year.
Then can I ask you about the state of the public finances? When we were in May this year, more than half of all adults were receiving considerable funding from the state. Nearly a third were furloughed. The OBR then predicted that this year's budget deficit would be just shy of £300 billion sterling. It's currently on track to being about £400 billion sterling. You obviously write and comment a large amount for us on the labour market, but what do you make of the fiscal position of the public finances, the scale of the deficit, which is already obviously adding to an already large debt?
Well, perhaps oddly, I don't worry about that too much. I think
you're in the Jessup camp there.
I am in the Jessup camp on this one, I think. I think that the danger is that we'll slip into a frame of mind which has us spending more and more in the future. I don't think the immediate, I mean, the immediate hit of this year can be funded. I mean, there's not a problem with this, I don't think. But if we get into the permanent habit of thinking we've got to spend more, we get into an MMT, modern monetary theory type mindset where the government doesn't have to worry about any kind of budget.
But there actually is a magic money tree, yeah.
Pardon?
That there actually is a magic money tree, yeah.
Yes, exactly. MMT.
So with that in mind, Len, before I let you go, what's your optimism rating? I think the barometer is a scale of 0 to 10, the freedom and prosperity in the UK in 2 to 3 years' time, sort of over the medium term. 2
to 3 years' time, one has to hope that you're coming out of this a bit. So I'll go as high as a 4, I think, on that.
As high as a 4?
That's a 4. And that was a struggle for you.
It was a struggle for me, Kate. I've been very gloomy about this. I've been cooped up at home for 9 months. I see no sign of the government really relaxing these restrictions. I mean, you were saying about the vaccine and so on, but they're not going to relax the requirements in pubs, in theatres, etc. for many, many months, however quickly we get the vaccine out. So, yeah, I'm pessimistic.
Okay, well then, thank you for your pessimism. Thank you for all of your work for the IEA over the year. Have a very Merry Christmas. Look forward to catching up with you in the new year, and hopefully we can spend more time in each other's company rather than just on Zoom and YouTube calls. Kate, please stay with us. There was one upside of this particular month there. It was very importantly, this will go down in the history books, of course, it's when episode 1 of Live with Littlewood was broadcast and hit the airwaves. It's when Live with Littlewood was launched. So thanks to all of those who've watched us over that period of time. We've clocked up quite a few episodes, lots of guests and lots of viewers, and make sure that you stay with us for the rest of the show, because we've got a whole ton coming up for the next hour and a half or so as we plough through the rest of the year. But that's my highlight from that particular month, the month of
Silver
May.
linings.
Big silver lining for me, that one. And I think our tech team have got a little montage to show about that. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this, the first episode of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome. We're back. Kapow, kaboom, boom, shakalaka. It's 6 p.m. on Wednesday. The good news is we have a stellar lineup of freedom lovers, optimists, crusaders, thinkers. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, stay free. Thank you. 25 episodes, didn't realise that. Oh, blimey. Spent a lot of time doing this, but we're going to move on to the month of June. We've got 2 more guests joining us. I think you might just have caught their faces on that little montage clip. Joined again by 2 regulars on the programme, Maya Tusi, classical liberal conservative YouTuber, and my good friend Alex Deane, writer, conservative commentator, font of all knowledge. A very, very good evening to you both, gentlemen. Maya, lovely to see you.
Hello.
Alex, lovely to see you as well.
Thank you very much.
Alex always does the smart thing with a bookcase full of important intellectual material, whereas I wear a saint scarf. Great to see you both, gents. June, I guess, was the month where a bit of sort of summer madness kicked in. We weren't allowed to the office or to hug our family or loved ones, but it was okay to protest. And of course, in Bristol, Edward Colston statues thrown into the river, and the battles over cancel culture and freedom of speech and Black Lives Matter reach new heights. We did an IEA video in June on monumental decisions, should statues be removed. Alex, you've had quite a lot to say on these sort of issues. Talk us through what you think the debate was at that time. Have we moved on from it? Was it a moment of summer madness? Have we now returned to normal? And what was at stake there? And how should classical liberals think about that?
It definitely wasn't just a moment of madness. It was a moment of madness, but it wasn't just that. It was a time in which there are culture wars that have been bubbling away for some time, and indeed have been pushed by both sides in some ways, because it advantages the extremes in the debate to have that culture war had. And sometimes in politics, it helps to have the culture war if you're doing badly in other wars. If you're not doing so well in policy, if you're not doing so well in economics, it suits you to have a far left, if you're the government on the right, it suits you to have a far left gang to rally against and to rail against. But it wasn't just a moment of madness. And I'm not being complacent about it when I say that I think things are a great deal better than they were in the summer. But I take great heart from things like the vote at Cambridge University to effectively protect free speech. It was more complicated than that, as academic squabbles always are. You know, why are academic squabbles so bitter? Because the stakes are so small. But actually, in that dispute, something really important did matter. And I take it as a good sign that we're getting somewhat back towards normality, and the belief that context matters, that free speech matters, and that tradition and heritage is part of something that matters. And so what was really at stake was the willingness and the ability to think that people could stand for more than one thing, that history is a complex thing, that we should try to judge things by the standards of their day and not wholly by our own, in which some glorious year zero means that we are the only wise generation, and everyone that came before us is, to varying degrees, some form of idiot that must be judged on the moron scale and castigated accordingly. The last thing I'll say before shutting up is that whilst I feel better about that statue's business now, I'm not complacent about it. What I feel worse about is what you were alluding to in your introduction, Mark, which is that I saw a differential in the willingness of the police to enforce the law, depending on what nature or type of protest that they were faced with. And actually, I have very little sympathy with the anti-vaxxers. I believe that Black Lives Matter, whilst I decry the organisation that has taken the term for it, I'm a great deal more sympathetic to the notion of Black Lives Matter than I am to anti-vaxxing. But the police should police without fear or favour. And when these causes, when these moments are gone, when the George Floyd episode, when the Coulston statue are part of history in the past, the fact that the police have shown themselves willing to police differently based on their attitudes, that's the thing that worries me most about June 2020.
Yeah, I was saying if Southampton matches were rebadged as Black Lives Matter protests, we probably would have been able to get all 30,000 people into the stadium.
No problem.
Maya, let me come to you. You describe yourself as both conservative and libertarian. So where do you stand on the statues issue and what we should make of our history? And is it appropriate that these people who made lots of money out of slave trading are still up? And is it an expression of free speech to, haul them down? A lot of people in the chat are saying that, it's just straight criminal behaviour, what happened on pulling down the Colston statue. What's your take on it, Maya?
Yeah, of course. Well, firstly, thanks for having me. I was told we're going to have festive background, so I've got my festive.
I'll put my festive hat back on. Done. You took me into it. Yeah,
but I got the flag. That's fine. No, so I think you're right. I mean, firstly, I'm generally a classical liberal libertarian. Culturally, to an extent, I'm conservative, so I believe in the country and family values. But there is a point about what happened in June, and actually, as you mentioned the statues, and Alex actually touched upon that at the beginning of what he said when it comes to cultural wars. And actually, to an extent, both sides, the extreme sides of both sides, have been at fault because. The two main reasons that this is actually happening in Britain now, the lazy argument partly is because Americans exported it, but the second part is that we spent the last few years being so complacent about it. You had the people on the right, the counterculture side, actually doing it the wrong way. They spend a lot of time trying to provoke the other side, the liberal left, the wrong way. And for example, they spend a lot of time trying to defend why you should be able to, as a joke, say Anna Suber is a Nazi. They tried so much to actually consider certain examples instead of actually doing what Ron Atkinson, for example, said a couple of years ago when he made a speech about free speech, saying that you should defend the fundamentals of our values and political, being against political correctness rather than trying to go in favor of that specific things. That's why the statue thing actually became a big issue. Just like everything became tribal. Now people on the right some people on the right who've been saying that the liberal left has become very tribal, they become tribal too. For example, you can't be a right winger and not support Trump, for example. If you don't support Trump, you're not right-wing apparently. And I'm like, that's just not the way we should do things. Or in this country, if you're a conservative, you have to support Boris Johnson. Like, well, why do you have to? And I think that's why everything just imploded, because of a few years of complacency, and we didn't even know how to react. I will just finish with this. The only way that we've been able to counter this to an extent is when the other side, the actual liberal left, if we call it them, or the Marxist, when they went too far. So actually, when we've been winning the arguments from our side, it's not because we managed to counter it or defend it. It's because they've gone so far badly that ordinary people were like, okay, no, this is too much now. The BLM stuff is too much. The Islamists going after Charlie Hebdo, that's now too much. It's no longer about respecting the prophet. It's actually, no, they're actually killing them. But that's the problem we have.
What's the sensible classical liberal line to take on this, on cancelling some of our history? You could see it one way, but on the other way, what's the appropriate use of the public square? I mean, I can remember tears running down my eyes when I was a 17-year-old boy seeing statues of communist dictators ripped to the ground in the former Soviet Union. Hurrah for that. So what's the best way of treating these symbols? How should we police or decide what's in the public square?
Yes, so I mean, there's a difference between being a hardcore libertarian, anarcho-libertarian, which will basically, if I were that, I would just advocate all those squares and statues to be privatized by McDonald's and just like give out free burgers.
Yeah, that is my solution, actually.
Yeah.
It's replace Colston with Ronald McDonald.
Yeah, but as opposed to the actual classical kind of English liberal side in the 19th century, especially, they were still to an extent culturally conservative. Like they at least tried to preserve the basic fundamentals of our culture. Without actually becoming completely like nationalist or neo-nationalist or things like that. You don't have to go completely hardcore, but just the fundamental values that we have. But you're right, there should be a balance, because if you completely say, don't touch it, just this is like a holy shrine, all the statues, that's also bad, because it's going to create this bubble and eventually it's going to explode like it did. So, it's some sort of dialogue,
sure.
Education, and, on a local level, if you want to have decisions made, referendums, things like that,
okay.
That's the best way.
Kate, what's your take on this? How should classical liberals police the public square, and what appropriate monuments, culture, or history, which is, for every nation checkered in some way, how should classical liberals feel that should be policed?
I don't think you have to police it. I think you can have the public have their say on it. It should be ideally through some kind of democratic process through which locals decide what is put in their public square. It's essentially art. It's public art, and it belongs to the people. And if they're not happy with it there anymore, I'm pleased that they're getting involved in the conversation. I think the problem with the Colston statue is that there had been very peaceful efforts to try to remove that statue, and of course the bureaucrats hadn't listened. I think it's yet again another reminder of state failure, even on a local level. Do I agree, broadly speaking, with people just going in and tearing down statues? No, I absolutely don't. But again, that's because I think that this art belongs to the people, and they should get to have their say on it. And I think everything that's been said has been very well said. Broadly speaking, we have to support free speech, and we have to support peaceful protest. And I'm inclined to think that you certainly don't decide which protests politically are safe from the virus and which ones aren't. But I'm more broadly speaking quite pro-protest, and they're outside, which is much better in terms of not spreading this virus. And there have been some really important moments this year where the public has needed to have their say. They've had their civil liberties taken away from them. The murder of George Floyd was horrendous, and I would remind British viewers, not the first time Americans have heard a Black man say, "I can't breathe" on camera. 6 years previously, Eric Gardner was strangled to death by New York police officers for selling single cigarettes. It was an issue that needed to have its moment. And I think we need to, as Alex says, be honest in supporting all of these issues of free speech and letting the public have their say.
Okay, but at the early stage of your remarks, I saw from Alex the fearsome Dino frown across his forehead. So I suspect he's going to want to come back at you on that.
Only one thing, and it's rare that I disagree with Kate, so I relish it when I do. I don't accept that the Colston statue episode was a demonstration of failure in state activity, national or local, when those who wanted the statue to come down peaceably didn't get their way. Because part of a democratic society and part of a peaceable social system means that sometimes you don't get your way and you have to try harder. You have to try again. peaceably again. Sometimes we lose things, we lose elections, we lose petitions. We don't get our choice of the person who's going up on the statue, or in this example, we don't get our way when the statue comes down. The answer surely isn't to take it into your own hands and say, the state has failed by not giving me my way, and therefore I'm going to have my way anyway. The answer is to try peaceably in the system that you have again. And indeed, if the system doesn't work, then give that a go. If you want to get elected and change things, get elected locally or nationally.
And very quickly, Alex, I mean, I agree with you. And that's why I said, broadly speaking, I don't support the actual pulling down of statues. But I do think it's important for classical liberals, especially, to note when people have tried to go through a peaceful process, when they have a good point and the system continues to fail them. Because how often this year have we just seen to what extent British institutions are not fit for purpose, whether that be patients who didn't get access to healthcare, whether that be people who haven't had a very legitimate protest or complaint listened to. So I think that's the point I was trying to raise, not the actual act itself.
But Alex, can I press you a bit on this then? If it's about the process by which this debate takes place, then you can certainly say that the removal of the Colston statue was criminal damage. I mean, you might even say it was rioting. I mean, this wasn't a council meeting with a show of hands. This was just people taking property that wasn't theirs, you know, and it's kind of... I say all that, Mark. They should be prosecuted. Right, but therefore, are you saying more relaxed about a university no longer, I can't remember which one it was, Liverpool or Manchester comes to mind, saying we're no longer going to call this the Gladstone building because William Gladstone was not a reasonable human being. He was a racist. I mean, that was done by a committee meeting. I mean, is it for you? Whereas I would have thought William Gladstone was a rather less offensive person than Colston. You see what I mean? So are you at all worried if it's done through the process that the particular university holds a committee meeting and they say, actually, we're going to rename that? Does that worry you a bit? Not at all? Or it does also worry me because it's insidious, because it happens under the veneer. The destruction of our history piece by piece happens under the veneer of benign academic process. But plainly, yes, violence worries me more, and people violently taking things into their own hands does worry me more. To add to the point that you make, Mark, I cannot remember either which university it was, but another university was after one of Pitt, I think it was Peel, and they had the wrong Peel. They had his brother or his cousin or his dad rather than the Peel concerned. It was Peel, I think. That really is guilt by association. Yeah, it's sort of Julius Caesar. I'm not Cinna, I'm not Cinna the protester. I'm Cinna the poet. Tear him for his bad verses. Tear him anyway. It's extraordinary. Well, the association is enough, and that sort of thing does worry me. Yes. But Maya, let me come back to you. Guido Fawkes released a list of other statues that might be up for consideration, slightly tongue-in-cheek. Cleopatra's Needle, she headed up a slave-owning and trading society. The tomb of Karl Marx, he's a notorious anti-Semite. Nelson's column, Nelson was not an abolitionist and apparently had friends who owned slaves. The tomb of William Wilberforce, he disapproved of female campaigners and opposed Catholic emancipation. As an evangelical Christian, we can probably assume he wasn't particularly progressive on LGBT rights either. The Gandhi statue, Gandhi campaigned in favour of racial segregation, arguing that Indians as a race were superior to, quote, savages or the natives of Africa. How much should we be digging into these things, Mayor, and then trying to have a debate about, like, is Cleopatra on the wrong side of the line, but Gandhi will give a pass to, yellow card to this one, red card to that one? How would even normal public discourse police this?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the biggest problem is that when it started in the summer with the statues coming down violently, a lot of people, whether it was the people in the mainstream media or a lot of people like out there who, I guess, out of fear because it was so violent, they actually became quite patronizing towards these young kids, the Marxists, and said, they shifted the argument towards, okay, let's have a debate about how to do it, just like what we said earlier about whether to do it democratically, locally, or whether just bring it down violently. I think instead of just going to that argument, because that's obvious, like, obviously don't commit crime, do it properly. We have to go back to the fundamental of this. You just listed the number of statues and figures. We need to actually have an intellectual discussion, but in a non-intellectual way. So instead of obviously doing it like in forums like this, where people on the right are talking about it intellectually, get the message out there, because people on the left, when they did it, they made it very simple. and well, quite wrong, but inaccurate. But they said, for example, this statue, racist, bring it down. Very simple. There's no like intellectuals a discussion about the background of the statue. So what we have to do is basically do the counter of that and say, just like what Alex said, for example, all these statues, all these figures, even on the left, the heroes of the left, compared to today's standards, they were all bad. They were either, or they had were racist or homophobic or something. There was something compared to today's standards. So we have to start from that argument first and say that, well, are you just going to bring down every single person, including those who gave you your own left-wing ideology, your heroes, your gods, and basically bring them down that way? Because otherwise, you have to bring down everything, because everything in the past, not just people, but ideas as well, compared to today's standards, were wrong.
Okay, but then what's wrong with my fairly purist libertarian option that would go something like this? The default is, if it's there, it stays up. But the state needs to raise revenue. We'll have a crowdfunder. And if you can raise the money to tear it down, have it shipped to a museum somewhere and replaced with a different statue, if you can hit that, that crossover point on the crowdfunder, that then triggers a bidding war between people who want to keep it up and people who want to tear it down. And we'll just have an ongoing bidding war. If you want the Churchill statue up, put a £5 behind it. If you want it down, put a £10 behind that. And we would actually find that our public statues were a reflection of how much people cared about our culture in a very, very public, unfolding way. What's wrong with that, Alex? We could marketize this problem away. By the way, I suspect that it's only a guess, but I suspect that relatively conservative and patriotic outcomes would be the consequence of that process. I would think Churchill would probably beat the Spice Girls, for sake of argument, on a crowdfunder.
I think you might wind up with a great number of statues of transitory or transient celebrity overtaking eternal verities. And I'm afraid I'm old-fashioned enough to believe in the canon. I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that there are qualities to which we might aspire, and that there are heroes and heroines that we should celebrate and venerate and seek to encourage others to pursue in their footsteps, and that's allowing the next bread and circuses moment to put the next winner of whatever celebrity.
Supposing I guaranteed a 100-year tenure, we'll bid for a 100-year tenure.
Well, that dismisses most of human history, and I wouldn't take that either.
I mean if Churchill wins now, he's there for 100 years, if you see what I mean.
Oh, I see. No, I still wouldn't take it, because the transitory feelings of the mob of the day are not what should determine what fine art is, and much statuary is fine art. And if it feels like this feels a bit rehearsed, you've tried this one on me before, Mark, and I thought it was wrong.
You've had time to reflect. I would have thought I would have persuaded you by now. Come on,
you have
I'm a
not
charismatic kind of guy. How hasn't it worked?
You have not shifted me in the meantime.
Kate, what's your view on that? I mean, people like you and I are, we think that there's private market mechanisms to solve these public good problems, don't we, Kate? You need to take yourself off mute, Kate.
Mark, do you think people should be allowed to buy each other's votes to have more than one vote?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah, I suspect you do, and I don't. I think that probably is a dividing line between us, and I think it's a similar argument, which is that one of the reasons that it works, and one of the reasons that to go out and vote, is a unifying experience, even if, as Alex was saying before, the person or the outcome that you wanted didn't happen, is because we truly are all in it together, and we all have an equal say. And I feel quite similarly about the public square. It is public. It is a place for us all to be. I love the idea of private companies putting money into it to make it a nice place, but I'm not sure I like the idea of the highest bidder getting to decide basically what we look up to and what we admire. And that's been a big question this year, whether it's, who you're voting for President of the United States, who you think is setting the best example on COVID, and certainly in the public square, what are we appreciating from history? And I don't think that should only be decided by the highest bidder, in the same way I don't think that the President of the United States should be decided by somebody who has the money to buy up the votes.
Ma, you got to be a bit closer to my line. This is supposed to be a libertarian channel. I've got surrounded by all these socialists and conservatives.
It's quite libertarian, frankly, where Alex and I are.
I mean, that's why I'm always going with the conservative-leaning libertarian, or classical liberals, because we have to protect the basics and fundamentals. Because, for example, right now, Mark, yourself, we say that let's do this as a policy for the statues, probably because statues seem like at this point a bit trivial as opposed to other big things. It's not a big deal to everybody out there because they're still there. So they're like, oh, everything's fine. So yeah, let's do a privatized process to get rid of them or not get rid of them. But it starts from here. It gets worse. What if next time, then they go after small things and then be like, okay, let's change the color of the flag. Let's change the actual flag. Then let's change the way we do free speech in this country. Then, well, we already have. Let's change the way we should stop queuing. We should stop holding doors. We should then stop. They go to actual policies and fundamental constitution. Everything's going to come down. Get rid of the constitutional monarchy. You start from one place. It's the same with sugar tax. We've been saying it for years. Don't do that. You're going to keep going too far. And they say, no, we're going to stop here. And you're going to keep going too far. So it's the same with the statues. They
never stop.
It's going to go too far. Exactly.
That's right. There's a ratchet effect here, isn't there, Maya? Where it only ever goes in one direction. And I would say that what starts with statues doesn't end with statues. In fact, it's not really about the statues to begin with.
It ends up with the curriculum changing and all of this sort of stuff. Yep. All right, Alex, I know I've failed over months to persuade you. You've nearly persuaded me, actually, so good job. Alex, let me come to you for your optimism rating, then Maya, then Kate, and thanks, Kate, for being my helper over this first half of the Christmas special. Alex, you're usually pretty punchy on this. You know the form, you know the guide. What's your number, my friend, and why?
It has been a tough year, and Britain is the first country in the world to be carrying out vaccinations, seeing us into Q1, when we will finish the transition period with the European Union and negotiate free trade deals on our own behalf as a sovereign country. It is plainly a 10.
Plainly a 10. No ifs, no buts.
How can you not be more optimistic about our national future than where we are now?
What is Alex drinking? What is Alex drinking tonight? I want that.
I'm going to toast our celebration afterwards.
The man's nothing if not consistent. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. It's been wonderful having you on the program this year. Always great to hear from you. Hope we can meet up in person before too long, my friend. Been great to have you, Alex. Have a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Maya, what's your number? So just to remind you, the rating is how optimistic are you about freedom and prosperity in Britain over the course of the next 2 or 3 years? Naught's North Korea, 10's kind of classical liberal utopia.
Yeah, I'm going to go with I'll give you the number first, then why. More of a 6, 7. Let's go with 7. So 7. Not too bad, but because kind of some of the things that Alex said, are going better than expected with the state of politics to an extent. But in terms of the future, but actually also economically, it's going to be very tough recovery. But the next 2 years, not that we're going to be completely prosperous, but we could come back slowly. But the way we do economics in the West, the whole Keynesianism on steroids is still going to be tough. But in terms of everything else, our freedoms and the way we live, everything else we have, it's going to be quite tough. That's why I can't give them like a 9 or 10. But because we have to go through the circle of absolute chaos, and we've been seeing the peak of it obviously with the BLM stuff and everything else, but I think there is a light. I can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and so 7 is fine.
Solid 7. Maya, it's been lovely having you. Good luck in all your endeavors. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Very Christmassy. Kate, thanks so much for being with us for an hour and a half.
Thanks for having me.
It must be it's way past your bedtime in the United States now, isn't it?
No, other way around.
Oh no, sorry, it's earlier there. That's right. You've got hours more drinking to go. Tell me how optimistic you're thinking. I guess I could sort of say about the West. You're a legend in your homeland as well as over here in the UK. So kind of combine the Anglosphere together and tell us what your thoughts are.
Not remotely a legend, but I'll take the compliment. Thanks. Look, you told me to be optimistic, so I was going to go for a 5, and I'll go for a 6 instead, just to boost that optimism a little bit. I think 2021 will be a better year.
Newcastle United lost 3-2, by the way.
That has not factored into my equation. I think the news of the vaccine can really only be positive. I think that it's going to be a long and painful recovery, frankly, especially on the economic side. I fear many people will be left behind, especially in the beginning. I think there's something about this K-shaped recovery that those in very comfortable middle-class jobs that can be done from home won't feel a major difference. If anything, they might do slightly better. And a lot of younger people, even older people who weren't ready to retire yet, who have lost their jobs, are going to really struggle to get back on the jobs ladder. So I'm torn on that front. But Joe Biden's going to be the new president of the United States. I'm looking forward to going back to criticizing him in the Democratic Party. It's been uncomfortable territory for me this past year supporting him. But actually, I think America is in a good place. I think it will also benefit from the vaccine. I think its economic comeback might even be bigger. And I'm just hoping for a little bit of political normality that we haven't had for a long time in the US.
Yeah, that's been years. So Kate, it's been absolutely lovely having with you.
Thanks for having me.
Hope to see you physically, not virtually, before too long. But thanks so much for appearing on the program. Enjoy the rest of your day in the United States of America, and thanks for being marginally optimistic. Six. Have a very, very, very Merry Christmas, and see you in the new year.
You too. Thanks.
So to try and keep the flow of optimism, or reasonable optimism, going, I've been giving away some of my money to you lucky people, but nobody claims it. So I just wanted to highlight my Christmas giveaway. Each week I pose a question. I'm usually not very good at working out whether the questions are difficult or hard. There's not going to be a question this week, but I'll give you last week's answer. I'm keeping my money in my pocket until the new year, then I'll start throwing my cash around. Last week we asked, what's the next letter in this 50-year sequence and why? And the sequence was HWCTMBBCM blank. What's the next letter in the sequence? And the missing letter is J. The letters represent the sequence of prime ministers in the last 50 years. Heath, Wilson, Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, and now Johnson. I thought that was quite tough, but we had an absolute flood of correct answers. Our random number generator has picked out the winner, and the winner is Chaminda Jayanetti. Congrats, Chaminda. We'll be in touch via email, and I will get you £50. I'd like to get that to you before Christmas. I can pay you directly into your bank account via PayPal, whatever you want. But congrats on that. And the quiz questions will be back next year. But I've got to get a better idea of whether they're easy or difficult, because the ones I think are difficult you will get. The ones I think are easy, nobody gets. Anyway, on with the year. And the month of July. I've got two of home team to help talk me through that. We're calling the month of July On Your Bike. The government announces it will give 50 quid towards bike repairs. We're now literally nationalising the repair of bicycles. Seriously, is this a good use of government or public money? All right, it's not much of it, but it shows you how the state is involved in every area of our life. Also starts to consider the banning of television advertising of so-called junk food, although junk food seems to include sandwiches and hummus and this sort of stuff. An anti-obesity strategy that just seems to be yet another example of the government overreaching into our daily lives. To consider this, I'm joined by an upside down Christopher Snowdon, who is in well, he's not quite upside. That's yeah, that's it. Bingo. Yeah, that's it. You're bang on now. I've got a darts board behind you. And our head of lifestyle economics, Scourge of the Nanny State. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Mark.
Waiting. And our very own academic and research director, Saeed Kamal. Saeed, good evening to you.
Good evening
to you. Right. So government overreach, I guess, is the theme here. I mean, July is usually a fairly quiet month, but that saw us pass over 100 days in some form of lockdown. So by that stage, we'd already had lockdown for about 33% longer than Edward V was on the throne. Lockdown was becoming the norm. And I've picked these two examples because they just show how much government has got into, you might argue, trivial parts of our lives, but government's sponsoring bike repairs and working out what foods can be advertised. Chris, has the government become, if you like, ever more interventionist, but in a rather pathetic and trivial way?
Yeah, and in a very negative way. I'd forgotten all about the bike repair thing, actually.
Oh my God, so you're going to be even more of a miserable sod now I've reminded you of it, yeah?
No, it makes me laugh, actually. It makes me laugh all the... Yeah, it's not just that the government's been incompetent with this, it's actively done things that are either incredibly trivial or incredibly damaging, like the thing Grant Shapps came up with this week about it was going to cut coach fares, I think, to encourage people to cram onto coaches to get up north to go see their families. It's an unbelievable idea of the government helping to run effectively COVID death buses and also subsidising railways. But yeah, the bike thing was another one from the random policy generator, same as Eat Out, Help Out. The obesity thing comes back to one of the government's perennial obsessions, which is food, which it seems to see as sort of the cure and the cause of COVID. So in August, which I dare say you'll come to, it was subsidising food. Now it's forcing us to buy food if you want to have a drink, if you're lucky enough to be in tier 2, which, as you can see, I am. And at the same time, banning advertising for, in practice, most food. So it's just such a random selection of nonsense. We're ruled by half-wits, as far as I can see.
I thought you'd take that sort of optimistic view of it. And Chris, now I've reminded you of it, could you just remind our viewers about what's involved in this sort of advertising banning now? You know,
everything.
Everything. But the idea, if you like, the headline is it's sort of junk food because we don't want kids eating too much McDonald's or too much chocolate or whatever. But what's included in it that, if you like, the average Joe on the Grant Shapps bus would not consider to be junk food?
Well, certainly anything that is sold on a bus, I imagine, will be considered to be junk food. Pretty much everything other than raw ingredients, give or take. So the public was sold this idea of, do you want to protect children from seeing junk food advertising on TV? And of course, the poll said yes, because people don't like advertising, people don't like. And in practice, it turned into not just a TV advertising ban before 9 p.m, but an internet advertising ban 24 hours a day that included every form of promotion you can think of. You can't advertise food on your own website, you can't advertise it in a text message, you can't advertise it in an email, and the scope of food is much broader than people think. So it includes things like, you know, sausages. Do people think that's junk food? I don't know, maybe they do. Bacon, perhaps they do, but that's certainly included. Anything that's considered high in sugar, salt, or fat. It would include orange juice, freshly squeezed orange juice. It includes basically most processed food does require fat or sugar or salt to make it palatable to people. It's all that people like Jamie Oliver do when they get a collection of raw ingredients. They put it together with a bit of salt or butter or what have you to make it tasty. Without it, it's not tasty. So effectively, it's a ban on advertising tasty food.
So give us an insight into the working of the minds at the heart of the beast. I mean, you know, Chris is paid to make these observations by the IEA, and oftentimes we'll say politicians, bunch of half-wits, don't know what they're doing. You've seen this from the other side of the fence. You're the academic and research director now at the IEA. You've been a long-serving senior politician within the Conservative Parliamentary Party in the European Parliament. You know the Conservative Party well. Tell us about the thought process. Why on earth do governments and politicians come up with this stuff, which is almost, in many cases, you could say, sort of too trivial to be malign, but you're wondering what on earth is going through their mind? I mean, it is central planning gone nuts, isn't it?
I think it also is a bit of, you get used to thinking that you can control the levers. And, you know, so you have one policy in one area and suddenly you think, well, hold on a minute, I can now, that may or may not have worked. And if you judged it worked, you think you can start controlling other outcomes. And very soon you get sucked into it. And also you get people saying, you know, the press or others saying, you must do something. And it's a very brave politician who turns around and says, actually, you know, I don't know the answer here. I'm not going to do anything. But I mean, I think what's most worrying about this, if you think about the bicycle example, I mean, I still don't understand why they felt it was necessary. We were told when lockdown came that people were cycling more. And so we're going to repair bicycles to encourage more people to cycle, even though more people are cycling more anyway. I wasn't quite sure what
I guess you could never have enough. You could never have too much of a good thing. You know,
well, it could be. Well, actually, don't waste a good crisis. You know, people are cycling more. One of the long-term policies may have been, let's get more people out of their cars onto bicycles. Let's use that as a ramp to continue this policy. And how can we get even more people cycling?
Yeah. But why even think, you say it would be a brave politician who says, we haven't got all the facts. You probably don't want politicians running your life. You probably want me just to keep an oversight on the big things that are happening, not worry too much about whether you can eat jam or repair the puncture on your bicycle. So I'm not going to do anything. Why is that bravery? I would have thought that would go down quite well with most ordinary people, wouldn't it?
Well, I suppose it goes back to when, I remember when I was a politician, I used to say to companies and others who would come and see me, I'd say, look, I would rather be quite libertarian about this and have no rules about this. But when something goes wrong, you get your mailbag fills up and people write to you and you're expected to do something. And I remember years ago, I got a letter from a constituent and he wrote a letter saying, I think the first sentence gave it away. I gave my life savings to a Mr. Khan in Dubai. That was the first sentence. And I thought,
I gave mine to a Nigerian princess via email.
Yeah, exactly. I gave it to
it's all going to come back, I'm told.
A Spanish
I'll
lottery
get 1,000% return.
And that they expect me to do something. So I dutifully wrote a letter knowing that I couldn't really help them. But I couldn't write back and say, having read your first sentence, it's your fault or I can't do anything. And so I think that politicians have to be seen to be doing something.
Okay. We're joined by Matt Kilcoyne from the Adam Smith Institute as well now. Matt, lovely to see you, regular on this show. Thanks very much for joining us. We were talking about the sort of trivial and annoying government interventions. I mean, I think they're pretty pernicious as well, but they're not sort of about fundamental liberties necessarily. They're just at the would you believe it end. Matt, how many fewer calories will we eat per day thanks to the government's clampdown on advertising according to its own figures? Do you know the answer to that
According
question?
to the government's own impact assessment, it'll be 2.8 calories.
You have got the answer bang on correct. And can you put that into how much is 2.8 calories? I've got what's in this?
According to the Sun, it is half a Smartie.
Half a Smartie.
Half a Smartie, which isn't actually that helpful because people still think of Smarties as being junk food. But it's something like an 80th of a piece of white bread,
right?
Like your toast in the morning. So it's like that. Like if you realize like just how many crumbs you get on a plate and how useless that is, and considering the average adult male will use over 2,200 calories in a day, we're looking at like absolute peanuts. And it's sort of like the idea that this is going to be in any way instrumental in reducing child poverty. And Chris actually has a great blog, I think.
Is that the argument? It reduces child poverty? I don't know.
That's the argument. The argument that the government wants to ban all advertising of everything from pasties to pork pies, Marmite, mustard, fish and chips, which they love, of course, getting a photo op with.
This will make children richer. How?
It will make
obesity, surely.
Yeah, it will cut childhood obesity because they won't see evil, pernicious, evil adverts. That are only done by greedy capitalists after a profit.
Got it. So, Matt, you guys at the ASI have recently launched the Mad Ad Ban Plan campaign. Apparently, this includes, I'm told, plans to ban local chip shops from tweeting about their food. Tell us what's at stake here.
Well,
I don't know if I can mention steak on YouTube anymore. That's probably banned as well.
If any curry house or chippy or Chinese uses Instagram or Facebook to freely advertise or paid advertise their products, they will be banned. Any specialist producer that made your local little chocolate shop, your local cafe that's made some flapjacks this weekend, your Macmillan's cancer bake sale with coffee mornings, all of those get hit by this as well. They wouldn't be able to advertise. And that's actually like so far reaching. It's actually very hard to explain to people the scope and scale of what's at stake here because it hits every business, nearly every single product. When Chris says it's nearly nothing but the greens, I would say, yeah, but have you thought about the fact that they may put bacon with the greens, or if they might put olive oil with the greens, or butter with the greens?
Matt, just help me here. What's the if all of this comes in, and I don't know, I tweet out as a private citizen, I don't know, a recommendation for my local curry house, which I think is really great. Panaha Curry House on Lavender Hill, really, really good. I had a takeaway from there last night. Am I then breaking the law? Or am I only breaking the law if they give me a free beer in return for saying that or some sort?
You wouldn't be breaking the law unless you're an influencer who's been paid to do that, or who has received payment in. But
if they're on their own Twitter account, they said, "Come round and enjoy our tasty chicken madras with some poppadoms, £2 off on Thursdays or something."
So a lot of what businesses have done over the past 6 months when they've been unable to trade is that they've started to produce cooking at home kits, right? Or they've started to do takeaway services, and they've put it out on Instagram, and they put like a nice quick either a paid or an unpaid ad, just put it out in their story with a link to where you can buy stuff. Right. That becomes unadvertisable because it's linking to a service. And there's a payment mechanism there. So they're advertising something which was described as high in fat, salt, and sugar, and it's not making a factual claim. If they're making a factual claim as well, then they're in real trouble. Chris knows a lot more about this, so I'll defer to him on this.
Chris, just spell out for us how mental is it, and then I want to move on to the month of August just to show how bizarre government policy is.
Well, what's a factual claim for a start? I mean, they get bogged down in these terminology they don't understand. So there was no definition for junk food, so they had to kind of conjure one up. They're not even sure really what advertising is, which is why they stick text messages and emails and stuff. And your own website, is that really advertising? And so you end up with this, what's a factual claim? It's actually, if you want to get into the weeds, it's very, very similar to the advertising restrictions on e-cigarettes, which allow factual claims. Basically, the price really may be the name of it, but you can't say food in this instance. You can't go, this is delicious or this is a bargain. You can just say cake, 99p.
Can you say things, I've noticed this in some adverts for cosmetic products, they say things like, it makes your hair much shinier, and then at the bottom it says 82% of women in a survey of 106 women agreed, or some such like. Is that all you need to do? So you say, curry's very tasty, and my factual basis for this is Mark Littlewood, who eats at my curry house.
Well, look, this is for the civil servants to work out. No country has been stupid enough to try and bring in legislation like this before. So we're in unknown territory, and it's for Whitehall to try and get this stupid idea from public health campaigners into workable legislation. And there's going to be so many absurdities along the way.
But Chris, it's world leading. It's world leading in that case, right? That's the
gold standard.
Yeah. So let me go back to you on that. It is sort of what will actually happen here, right? Because obviously, if you want to be, if you like, hysterically against it, you could say that the curry house owner will sort of, face a stretch in prison for saying that, mentioning that his curry is tasty on Twitter. Isn't the bigger danger that you'll get kind of arbitrary bureaucrats, right? So actually, you'll probably get away with it as the local curry house. Nobody will bother to prosecute you. They won't have enough regulators to do it. But if you really wanted to pick on that particular curry house owner for some other reason, or hold a sort of Damocles over him, or get him to withdraw a planning permission, or you just don't like him politically, is that the danger, do you think, Saeed, that it won't be defined, as Chris rightly says, it's impossible to define it. So it will be at the discretion of a kind of army of public health bureaucrats who are unlikely to be able to use their power objectively, even if they wanted to.
Yeah, I think it could end up like the local trading standards officers' campaigns against sellers who continue to sell in pounds, for example, a few years ago. So what happens, you've got a willing buyer and seller, you go into your local curry house, they know you well enough and trust you, and say, hey, Mark, tell you what, I'll give you a free takeaway tomorrow. Could you post this up? No payment has officially has taken place. Or them well enough, right, and a nod and a wink, they'll give you a couple of extra poppadoms or whatever because you post up on Instagram saying, isn't this great? And what will happen in certain cases, you'll get local officials who decide that it will start investigating. And a few years ago, I think you must remember when there was a whole debate about metric measures. And you actually had local trading standards officers go around markets and prosecuting fruit and veg sellers, where there was a willing buyer and seller, where the buyer wanted to buy in pounds, and the seller was selling because that buyer wanted to sell in pounds, yet they were being prosecuted because they weren't doing it in metric measures. I think that's what you'll see.
Yeah, and that is zealotry, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're falling behind on schedule, so let's move on to August, because this is quite a good segue. With delicious timing, the government's anti-obesity strategy is followed by Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out campaign, where you got taken off your lunch or dinner tab. I can't remember the details now. Was it half price up to
Mark,
£10
you
person?
You didn't eat enough. You didn't eat enough out then, during.
I did. Believe me, I took. Maybe I didn't make as good use of it as you did, Matt. But I'm too lazy to look at the bill. But having told us that you can't advertise your tasty pizza, the government now decides it's going to subsidise the eating of it. Chris, question for you: Eat Out to Help Out cost £850 million in subsidies. Do you know how much it was projected to cost at the outset?
$500 million.
Bang on!
Yeah.
Somebody's leaked you my script. And that 350 million overspend was entirely down to Matt Kilcoyne. So he boasted he was going to go around using this. He sure as heck did.
So why is he not obese?
Well, you can only see him from the neck up, right? That's why he's slouched in his chair. He actually now weighs 48 stone. That's why you can only see him from the neck up. Matt, what did you make of this particular effort to assist the hospitality sector? I mean, there seems to be, I'll be in trouble with the mental health people for saying that it's schizophrenic by the government, but as Chris was saying, what is the government's attitude towards food and eating? Not that it should have one, but if it's going to have one, it should have one, not a totally contradictory one each month.
I'd agree. Like, I wouldn't say schizophrenic, maybe, but I would say Janus-faced. The government has chosen to do, like, give with one hand and then take with the other. Like, some months the Treasury has won out, and some months the Department for Health has won out. And some months we've ended up subsidizing the various hospitality businesses that are struggling this year. They've been giving them government grants, they've been giving them C-bills, they've been giving them access to finance, they've been giving them subsidy for people to go out and eat. And then some months they've decided that, like, actually we're just going to starve you, we're going to hit your business, you're not going to be able to advertise, you're not going to be able to sell your wares. And like, we're going to restrict you and who you can serve and when and what you can serve. And it just feels like all of that muddled, incoherent, inconsistent policymaking that was at the heart of the May government has fed and leaked over into the Boris government, when we were told that this is freedom-loving Boris. And it's because I really think that he hasn't quite decided what kind of a prime minister he wants to be and what kind of a prime minister, like, Britain he wants to lead. And obviously the chaos of the pandemic leads to some still sort of muddled decision-making. But for the hospitality sector especially, it is incredibly difficult trading conditions to decide to not have someone at the helm who's decided whether they're going to help or hinder them. And a lot of the sort of, like, Eat Out to Help Out, which I said at the beginning of Eat Out to Help Out was a mad policy that was designed to get people into places that was very likely to end up with more spread, and which would be more expensive than they projected. But I also said, look, they're doing it. You may as well take advantage of it, especially if we had COVID, because you like, why not go and enjoy free money from the taxpayer? You're never going to get it again. Go and eat in all those restaurants that you've been told you can't afford because you're going to get 10 quid off every time you go for a meal.
I think
Chris, come in.
I think the anti-obesity thing genuinely came from Boris having a near-death experience and looking for some kind of policy to fight back on that problem, combined with the fact that this year the Department of Health has had much more power than it's ever had before, and the people at the Department of Health have been pushing this stuff for a long time. Those two things combining led to the anti-obesity strategy being pulled out from nowhere, having been kicked into long grass numerous times. The Eat Out to Help thing, which obviously is a massive U-turn in so many ways, just came from the government panicking about the state of the economy. There probably is something similar in January or February, whenever the statistics come out showing how many people have lost their businesses and jobs.
But so do you think that this is a problem on the sort of muddled? You were just saying, it might have even been the personal health experience of the Prime Minister that's led to this particular thing. But I approve of neither policy, but neither Eat Out to Help Out nor the advertising ban. But I can't see how anyone, however brilliant a political contortionist one is, and the Prime Minister is quite a good one, could reconcile those as being remotely coherent.
No, I think, as Kate said earlier in the programme, that the Prime Minister, who is someone who looks very much at experiences and looks at policies based on that, and the fact that he got COVID, and it was, I think the newspaper said it was partly the fact that he was out of shape made it worse for him. We don't know whether that's true or not, and I'm not a medical expert, but the fact that he was told that. Thought, well, I'm going to do something about this. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, what coincided with that, as Chris says, the Department of Health officials and others who've wanted these campaigns for a long time don't waste a good crisis. Use the crisis to get the policy you've wanted for a long time.
Extraordinary. So stay with us, Chris and Matt. I want to get a couple of things out of you. Firstly, who's your Scrooge and Oddbody of the Year, your hero and your villain of the year, Matt? And what's your optimism out of 10 for the UK in 2 to 3 years' time? How ASIE or IEAE will the UK be in 2 or 3 years' time? But who's your Scrooge and your odd body? Who's your hero and your villain of 2020? And then I'll come to Chris.
My favorite was when I was asked this earlier, who's my odd body of the year? I actually genuinely had to ask who that was.
Oh, hurrah! Thank you for that. I was like, nobody in the Director General's office had a bloody clue either, and we've just been told what idiots we were for not knowing. So, yeah, okay. It's years since I've watched Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, so thank God somebody else has endorsed that. Thank you. Okay, cool.
Sorry. In which case, the odd body of the year is Ugo Sahin and Özlem Türeci, the Turkish migrants who founded BioNTech. And led to the Pfizer vaccine, the first vaccine. I think they are the unsung Time Person of the Year 2020.
Quite sung.
No. I mean they were overlooked, shall we say, for Time Person of the Year 2020 when they decided Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were it. Like, these are the people who are going to save millions upon millions of lives and get and billions of people back to normal life. So I think they're my
choice. Good choice.
Yeah. Scrooge of the year is Nicola Sturgeon, who has used this crisis. She's not wasted a good crisis. She's used this crisis to push devolution for difference's sake, and has used it to create a wedge between the rest of the British people to try and drive home a majority for her next year, and then a referendum in which she wants to break up our country. So she's the Scrooge.
Okay, and your number?
Here we'll go. Well, you're seeing red. I can see you're all wearing red. I'm all in blue, seeing blue, I think, today, because unfortunately Mark Drakeford, the Welsh Labour leader, has just banned me, made it illegal for me to go home for Christmas. We'll see how long that one lasts and whether I decide to be a bit Edward Longshanks and just walk over the border anyway. But we'll see. Right now I'm feeling quite down, so it's about 4 out of 10, or a little bit miserable for next year, I think.
Sorry to hear that. Good luck, Matt. Been lovely having you with us. Look forward to catching up with you in the new year. Have a Merry Christmas. And Chris, what's your number? Just to let you know, the rough average must be somewhere around the 6 or 7s now. That's going to plummet now I throw this to Snowden.
We're tempted to bring it down by saying a 1, but that's a cynical move. I wouldn't do that. I'm going to stick with 3, which is what I've been saying the last few weeks. It could well go down. It's not going to go up. 2021, particularly the first half of it, in many ways is going to be even worse than 2020. I don't know why people can't see this. The 900,000 redundancies announced just this week, and that's with furlough in place. We're looking at a horrendous train crash of an economy, combined with all the other problems. The debt, inflation, where's inflation going to go? If it goes up, we're in such big trouble. So yeah, I'm going to give it a 3. Heroes and villains, and I agree with Oddbody, and I watch It's a Wonderful Life every year, and I still didn't get that reference. Hero, somebody said Liz Truss before, so I won't say that again. I'll say Anders Tegnell instead, the cool as ice Swedish epidemiologist who's been keeping Sweden free this year. He has a lot of ill wishes, has a lot of haters and losers out to get him, scoffing every time there's a bit of a second wave in Sweden. Well, Sweden has a second wave, and yet it keeps getting overtaken in the death stakes. I think it's got the 26th highest death rate from COVID in the world. Not great, but a hell of a lot better than the UK and many other European countries. And in 10 years' time, when people ask Swedish people what they did in 2020, they'll have something to say, unlike people in the rest of Europe. So good on him. It's not really him, he's the face of it. It's the Swedish constitution, I gather, that prevents lockdown. But either way, even if they have a full lockdown, as people keep saying they will do, over winter, they've still had a much better 2020 than the rest of us. Villain, I guess almost his opposite number. I'm going to say Matt Hancock. So many other people.
Hancock's already been taken by Mike Graham. He's gone. He's off the table. He's been used.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't pick up the Matt Hancock voodoo doll. Mike Graham's walked away with it.
All right, I missed that. In that case, I'll say someone from Sage. Could pick any of them. Susan Mitchie's a good choice. I'll go John Edmonds, just because John, I don't know if you know who John Edmonds is. He kind of looks like a deflated Simon Pegg and sounds like him as well. And he is always calling for lockdown after lockdown at the moment. The reason I'm picking him is because he's such a blatant hypocrite. There is footage on YouTube you can watch of him speaking not 9 months ago, explicitly calling for a herd immunity strategy, explicitly saying that lockdowns are ridiculous, unworkable, and absurd. And yet he's still invited onto TV, never reminded of what he said back in March. He's a symptom of a failed public health establishment, people who have been, and this is a public health industry in general have been massively exposed this year. My highlight, by the way, is Public Health England being abolished and Turkey to Us coming back, which those two things normally in any given year would make it one of the best years ever. It's only the whole police state.
The backdrop hasn't been
balanced it out.
But Chris, thanks for ending this year's Live with Littlewood with a little ray of sunshine. Always lovely to see you. Hope to be able to see you in person next year. Good darts, Chris. Very good darts. Matt, lovely to see you. Saeed, stay with us. We're going to move on to September. And Tom Harwood is joining us from the Guido Fawkes website. Tom, sorry to keep you waiting. Lovely to have you with us. We're moving into September. September, October would sort of normally have been party conference season. Tom, good evening. Tom always looked so cool and slim. He didn't take any use of the eat out to help out. Handsome, slim kind of guy. It was the party conference season. That's what it should have been in September. Usually an opportunity for political parties to hit the reset button. Think tanks such as the IA and others often rock up for these gatherings to meet people, politicians, and shoot the breeze and try and spread some ideas into party politics rather than just sort of rah-rah conferences. But as everything with 2020, nothing's been ordinary. Virtual conferences became the norm. I don't know whether the Conservative Party conference would have been a celebration of their election victory or actually whether the cracks are already starting to appear less than a year on. Obviously, the Labour Party is now under new leadership. Parliament itself has been operating pretty much virtually rather than packed into one place. Tom, how is this change from physical to virtual changing our political discourse? I mean, I quite missed going to Tory party conference. You just meet hundreds of people face to face. Even if you only have a minute or two with them, you're able to make old acquaintances again. We usually go to more than that as well. I would have usually gone to the DUP conference as well. And all of that's just been stripped away. Now, it's not about my hobby, but doesn't this sort of stop political discourse in a meaningful way? We're all just doing this sort of stuff, which is good, but not the same.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly disheartening as a journalist to virtually go along to one of these things and not have any alcohol, because that's the biggest thing that, of course, generates the news line. It's usually the fringe events that are the exciting ones. It's a think tent that's held every year, usually generates some great content, particularly if we're looking for something to put up on the site. And equally, it's the after hours. It's the after the formal conference has closed, once everyone's sort of out in the Midland Hotel in the bar, or out further in town. That's the place where the stories are generated. It's the karaoke nights. It's the drinking at the bar that generates the value of the conferences for people like me. And sadly, none of that was there this year. It was incredibly clinical. And aside from a few sort of digital pub quizzes, there was an excellent one actually hosted by the Conservative History Group, which I participated in. I managed to come 9th in the Conservative History Group quiz.
How many members does the Conservative History Group have?
I think there were several hundred, maybe 200, but I don't want to take any of this up for boasting. But no, my reading of William Hague's biography of Pitt the month before, I think, helped out quite a lot. But no, generally, the whole magic of conference was lost this year because it was sanitized, it was clinical, there wasn't the raw energy and, frankly, alcohol-fueled discussion that makes a conference a conference.
Yeah, we ran the think tent, which Tom referenced, that the IA runs every year with the Taxpayers Alliance, usually a big marquee at Tory conference, and we kind of hold the discussions there that we criticise the Conservatives for not being willing to address or debate in the conference room. One year I do remember us actually holding a debate on equality, why it doesn't matter. And one journalist said that is the absolute definition of a fringe meeting. But we were at least pushing ideas, not just sort of rah-rah politics. Spade, what's your take on this? The kind of, is moving to this virtual world sort of dehumanizing political discourse in the way that Tom suggests? And I guess to people, the vast majority who never go to a party conference and would never want to, this all sounds very in the beltway. But nevertheless, having think tankers, journalists of all sorts and politicians and party activists were side by side talking to each other at fringe meetings in bars and the rest of it, I think is a helpful part of our political discourse, even if it's only a tiny fraction of people who engage with it. Whereas this sort of virtual conferences for all the parties is just more kind of central party control. It just makes it even more of an advertisement rather than a discussion. Do you not think?
Yeah, I mean, long before I was elected as an activist, we loved going to party conference. Exactly as Tom says, the exciting moments as the parties, all the main political parties started stage managing their debates. So they weren't really debates. There were a series of questions telling you if you're in government, how wonderful you are as a party of government. If you're in opposition, how terrible the government is and how wonderful you're going to be when you win the election. Even the Lib Dems believe that they were going to get into power one day. And then actually, if you're interested in ideas and debates and networking, which is all part of politics, it is the fringe events. The fringe events where people speak openly about their frustrations with their party's policies, where they challenge them, where they hear new ideas, hadn't thought about them, and they welcome the think tanks there. And then the networking that happens late at night, where into the early hours, people staying up 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, because they can't be bothered to go to the hall for the first morning to debate, just to hear the party leadership telling you how wonderful they are.
Yeah, I think I've hardly ever been into the main conference hall at any of the party conferences I've gone to. But Tom, you're basically an investigative journalist. So when you are able to attend these things rather than sort of, just get given the data to you on YouTube or on Zoom and try and get in a question in the Zoom chat, how much confidence should we have in your profession? Are you really looking for ideas, or are you turning up at think tank run by the IEA because you're looking for that gotcha moment? You're looking for the gaff, or are you turning up because you actually want a serious debate about whether rules difference principle is actually the correct way of looking at income inequality in the 2020s?
When you put it like that, I think it's pretty clear the thing that's going to get the clicks, that's going to get the interest, is perhaps the gaff more than the substantive policy. However, I think it genuinely is a bit of both. If there is something that a minister or a senior parliamentary figure endorses, for example, or discusses that is a substantive change in policy, of course we're going to run that. That's something that's really interesting. However, that being said, I think the biggest story that we ran, not in the virtual conferences but in the normal conferences the year before, were the young activists who were overheard in the bathroom next to the Prime Minister as they were undergoing something that was less than conference broadcastable in the same cubicle of a loo. I think that was one of our most read stories of that particular conference. So of course it's both. It's the scandal and the policy, but that's the magic of conference. It brings it all together. It brings people together, and that's something that we missed this year.
Mm-hmm. In September, Boris Johnson said, here is a quote, "COVID is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime," unquote. Do you think that's true, Saeed?
I mean, I can see it as a politician, as definitely, because one of the it's a bit. I mean, people were comparing it to a war. Don't forget that, and don't remember. Even we had webinars where I think we were looking at Earhart and how how the economy in Germany recovered after the war. So people were comparing it to it's a very difficult time, unforeseen, and politicians, like many people, just didn't know what to do. And I think part of the problem was...
but hang on, he didn't say that. He didn't say this was... If he'd said, COVID is unpredictable and I don't know what to do, I would have put a different quote.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
What he said is, it's the single biggest crisis the world's faced in his lifetime. He was born in 1964.
Yeah, well...
the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't count, I guess, but quite a lot of other stuff does.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it, but as a politician, why he would say that. Yeah, of course, I can see that. What he's really projected is the biggest crisis he's probably faced as a politician.
All right, it's all about him. Tom, would you and your journalists have held him to account on that? Here's a few other numbers for you. COVID is the single biggest crisis the world's faced in his lifetime. He was born in 1964. HIV/AIDS, first reported in 1981. That's killed about 76 million people. Hong Kong flu killed about 80,000 UK citizens in 1968 to 1970. That's within his lifetime. I haven't even mentioned Mao's Cultural Revolution, the threat of all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union, Chernobyl, genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about things that directly affect people in Britain, I think COVID's killed more Brits than the Blitz did. To put this in perspective, right, we're looking at 60,000 deaths of Brits, and that's even with the measures that the government's taken. So I think it's not an unreasonable comparison to say that this is in the realm of something comparable to Suez or the World War in terms of people living in this country. And certainly, if we look at the debt profile of this country, you can see the ballooning of national debt at times of global conflict and at the time of COVID. I think that's not something that we should overlook. So in that sort of geopolitical context, I think that generally is the ballpark we're talking in. And yes, there's obviously semantics as to, okay, what particularly counts higher one than another. But I think generally this is one of those events that when I am 80 years old, I'll be telling my grandchildren about. I think that's a fair comparison to make.
And do you think then, Tom, it's going to be as much about the backwash as the actual COVID itself? Of course, it's horrific. Tens of thousands of people have died of this ghastly disease. I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm just trying to put it into context. But we also discovered in the month of September that £3.5 billion in the coronavirus job retention scheme, i.e. the furlough scheme, have been claimed fraudulently or paid out in error. So that's about 5 to 10% of the cash have gone awry. Let's put that into context. That's about 10% of our defence budget just lost on this particular scheme. Do you think that as we emerge from this, and let's hope the vaccine kind of rolls out and we can get back to normal, actually COVID won't just be about COVID, it will be about the cost of COVID, the state of the public finances, whether the economy's on its knees and the rest of it?
Yeah, I mean, we have been so fortunate that the cost of debt has been so low at this point in history. The problem is if we see the contextual spending of COVID and apply it to other situations, which simply cannot be done. The good thing, I suppose, or the silver lining about COVID is this is a sort of a one-off cost. This is not something that we can do again. In many ways, actually, only because we were in control of the finances before this crisis were we able to tackle it in the way that we did and have one of the most generous systems for compensation for those out of work in the world. Fundamentally, we've got to see this in the moment that it was delivered. If we look beyond this time and think that we can, if in terms of the next recession, let's just furlough everyone again, that simply won't work. What we need to recognize in the case of this pandemic is these were unique solutions for a unique once in a century crisis. And the real problem will be if politicians start trying to apply the unique situation of this crisis to future potential crises. That can't happen.
Well, and that's always the worry for those of us on the pro-freedom, liberal-leaning side, right, Tom? I mean, this is what Hayek warned about after the Second World War. Central planning worked very well to beat the Nazis. So why don't we apply it to housing and health and education and poverty relief? Do you think there's any danger that that's what's going to come out of it? We've had some discussions earlier in the show. Actually, Christian Niemitz was relatively optimistic. He said the government could keep these powers, but they want to. But others would say, certainly if you look back to the, say, Hayek's seminal text, The Road to Serfdom, that they'll say, we, the NHS, defeated COVID-19. This is now a reason for us to do 1,000,001 other things, that we defeat 1,000,001 other villains, and indeed apply the, chief medical officer's advice to virtually every matter of science or gravity on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have been amazing at rolling out this vaccine. That is a real point of pride for this country. However, if we look at the
we've been amazing
stage of
at promising
pandemic,
to roll it out. I don't know how rolled out it is yet, right?
Well, we've got 160,000 more people vaccinated in this country than any other country in the world. However, if we look at the early stage of this pandemic, this country did not fare well. We listened to the sage advice, and there are publicly available minutes from the gold standard scientists in this country saying that we should not lock down, that we should avoid the heavy suppression strategy because that would inevitably lead to a bigger peak before. That's the advice that Sage gave the government, and that's the advice that the government followed. However, now, with the benefit of hindsight, it looks like perhaps we should have locked down a week or two earlier and we could have saved tens of thousands of lives. So I think that it has been a point point within the context of this pandemic that the organs of the British state have not fared particularly well, particularly if you look at a country like Germany that was able to deliver the mass testing first of any country in Europe, and the way that they did that through the private sector and through universities and through a pluralistic delivery system, whereas we tried to centralise it within Public Health England in this country. I think that the lessons that can be learnt from this crisis actually don't point in the same way that the Second World War did towards a collective solution. They point to a pluralistic solution. But more than that, we are incredibly lucky that this was a pandemic that struck at the beginning of a political term. If it struck at the end of a political term and we had a new government potentially taking the reins just as it was finishing, that was the danger that happened at the end of the Second World War that cemented the changes that no one wanted to see in the long term. And the fact is that we will be over this pandemic by the time that we get into the second half of this premiership, and we'll be able to wind down the incredibly invasive restrictions that have been placed on us for the last 8 or 9 months.
That's pretty cheery, Tom. So before I wish you a Merry Christmas and let you go, what's your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer rating, an integer between 0 and 10?
My God, I would have given you an 8 yesterday. However, this morning, the government repealed that housing algorithm that would have delivered a huge number of a much greater supply of housing, particularly in those Tory seats. But they've resisted that. They're rolling back on some reform. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to give a 7 this evening. A solid 7.
Hasn't gone well. Tom, lovely to see you. Have a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. Hope to be able to catch up with you in person for a beer next year. Always a delight to see you. Follow Tom's work on the brilliant Guido Fawkes website. Our cousin Tom's here, the science editor of the Times. Tom, lovely to see you. Thanks for waiting for us. Glad to see you're not following the government's alcohol advice. Very sound, very sound. Good to see you, Tom. You've been fantastic telling us all about the science, Tom. I mean, I like the science bit, but I don't derive my public policy positions from scientists, merely the science from scientists. Can I just go back to the point that I put to Saeed and Tom? In September, we'll roll on to October in just a second. Boris Johnson said, "COVID is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime," unquote. He was born in 1964. Do you think that statement is true or false?
I suspect you could make a very good case that there were several nuclear crises that would have been quite a bit worse had they happened, and the expected badness, if you multiply the probability of them happening but by the badness, would have been a lot worse, but they didn't happen. I mean, since that period, it's difficult to point. I mean, you could certainly say it's not an unreasonable statement. I don't think there's any particular slam dunk, unarguable counterexample in that period.
My counterexample was Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, the Cold War, and HIV/AIDS killing 76 million people. Those are my 3 counterexamples.
I think AIDS is a bit about half that, isn't it? But I think the Cold War, you could make the case, but in terms of some sort of global event that's happened to lots of people, I thought it's certainly a biggie. I mean, I'm not sure we necessarily have to rank these things.
But the Prime Minister did. He said it was number 1.
Apparently I'm a bit quiet. I'm going to move myself closer and talk up. So you're going to see
better still. Okay, but I want to move on to October, but I want to get quite a lot of sciencey stuff out of Tom. He's been a brilliant journalist this year. Really, his stuff in the Times has been absolutely fascinating and on point. If you want to know what's going on, follow Tom Whipple's stuff in the Times. It's been excellent. But come October, we've got no beers and lots of tears. COVID-19 cases in the UK passed the 1 million mark. Unemployment on the economic side reached about 4.5%, quite high by very modern standards. Redundancies at their highest level since 2009. Students confined to halls of residence around the country. Sales in hospitality plunged by a third in pubs and restaurants. And then this 3-tier system sort of came in, where there were, in order to try and keep the R rate down. Saeed, I'll come to you in a minute about what the public policy response, but again, let me start with Tom. Do you think these are sensible scientific responses to the problem? And do you think there's been a kind of shift from moving goalposts, or I'm even concerned that it's sometimes playing different sports about the R rate, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and we'll have to be a bit tighter in Manchester, and obviously London's now just tightened up. Is this sensible public policy on a scientific basis, or is it sort of throwing mud at a wall, often missing and not seeing much of it stick?
I mean, I think those two options aren't mutually exclusive. You know, we are throwing mud at a wall. These are people we're dealing with, not equations. And we are people act like, you know, you hear this thing, oh, a lockdown hasn't been tested, it hasn't if this was a medical intervention, it wouldn't have passed the sort of gold standard trials. It's not some sort of recherche biomedical concept. It's simply trying to make people meet less. And all of this is about that. And yeah, people find ways around things. People don't behave as you wish. That's what economics is about. So it is both a reasonable response and throwing mud at a wall and hoping that some sticks.
And tell me, Tom, about this has been sort of hindsight for 2020, but I'm hoping we can look forward to a better 2021. And I'm hoping you can give us some notes of optimism about the vaccine, or rather, I should say, the vaccines that are coming on stream. I mean, the last time you were on the show, we were, I think, applauding the efficacy of it, and it was the Pfizer-BioNTech one that, you know, just hit the 90% plus rate. We obviously got the cheaper, easier to deliver and refrigerate Oxford one. How quickly can we bring this to an end? I appreciate I'm asking an administrative part about science rather than the efficacy of the vaccine itself. But sort of slightly in my head, and I'm plucking the numbers a bit out of thin air, let's say there's 3 million vulnerable people in Britain. How fast can we get them vaccinated? Can we do that by, I don't know, Boxing Day? And then we can all go back to normal, can't we?
Well, yeah. So we've done 140,000 as of today, which is both, you know, impressive and nowhere near what we need to do. We need to hit, bear in mind, everyone's having 2 doses. And there aren't 3 million vulnerable people. The aim for phase 1 is to vaccinate about 20 million. So the aim is that 99% of the people who would have died in the first lockdown are now vaccinated. So you look at the maths, we need to be up fairly rapidly to 400,000 odd vaccines a day if we are to get most of those done through the winter, which is the aim. So that, and if that happens, then I think spring will feel like a release. It won't be a perfect release, but compared to now, and with the help of the weather, I think basically from spring it'll feel like we're returning to normal extremely rapidly. But the logistics is big, and we need to do things fast.
But Saeed, let me bring you in here. Do you think that the goalpost I now really want to see from the government, and yeah, I guess it's fungible, but is more or less, once we vaccinate, you know, we know who the vulnerable people are by and large. Yes, it's fungible. So let's get the vaccine to them, and then we can all go back to normal. I mean, to be frank, if the 3 of us are not vaccinated, we should continue to roll that out and get the 3 of us vaccinated. But it's not obviously a reason to kind of ban people going to football stadiums or having a pint in the pub or going to a restaurant, right? I mean, we're so clear on the demographics. So I almost want, and I appreciate I'm asking for too simple a number, that once we've got everybody over the age of 75 and everybody who's type 2 diabetes or a chronic asthmatic or has got emphysema vaccinated, then lockdown will end in its entirety. Do you think the government should sort of set that target? Say, look, we'll try and get there by March, might be April, might be May, you know, we'll see how quick we can run. But that's the target. And a bit like a kind of Blue Peter fundraiser, we can see how well we're doing on the thermometer, but no, when we get to the top, that's it. The coronavirus liberty restriction bill is rescinded in total.
Yeah, I think what most people want to see is an outline of what the strategy is, but also an explanation. So if the government says, look, this is our aim, these are the vulnerable groups, here are the numbers, we're going to try and get to most of them. The rest of you, be careful, but we're not going to ban you from going to restaurants, etc., and explain the trade-offs. I think one of the big problems for me of the whole way the government has handled it is that they haven't treated people as grown-ups. Now, we know there are always some people who will not adhere to the rules or adhere to the guidance and feel, people who, we've been advised to wear masks. You still see it on the public transport. There are moments no one's looking, they bring their masks down, whatever. That's human nature. But treat the public like adults. Tell them the reason you're making these decisions and what the trade-offs are.
And Tom, coming back to you, do you think there's enough? I was asking a little bit about the 3-tier system. Sorry, I didn't press you enough. Is it sensible to sort of say, well, blimey, London's now the R rate's gone above 1, so all the pubs have got to shut on Wednesday night. Looks like in Cardiff it's still 0.85, so their pubs can stay open or whatever the hell it is. Is that a sensible way of doing it from high command? Or should we have allowed more experimentation? We have 24 different elected mayors across Britain. Do you think it's possible? Now, obviously, I know people can cross barriers, right? But do you think it would have been more sensible, and indeed across the world, to sort of say, well, we're going to try this, you try that. Our trade-off between keeping the hospitality sector alive and the R rate being 1.2 rather than 1, we can live with it, we think. Or do you think this tiered system by central government is a sensible way of even approaching the problem?
I think it's not an unreasonable way of approaching the problem. The problem with letting everyone go their own way is that this is ultimately a collective problem. And you can say that at the individual level or the regional level or the state level. I mean, I would be really annoyed if I was Vietnam and Singapore at the moment, when I could have actually sort of resumed to a large degree normal life, except for the fact that there are these other useless countries around me that have completely failed to do what we have done. I think you could imagine if the mayor of Liverpool or something just decided that we're going to be the Sweden of Britain and just continually amplify and then seed out coronavirus cases. I think it would be very difficult without travel restrictions internally in Britain. I think it would be very difficult to have some sort of properly devolved policy like that.
And what do you think, Tom? This offends all of my civil libertarian convictions, but about some sort of passport to access. I'm going away on Friday in order to get into the country I'm going to. I need to show I was COVID-free. I've just got the test results back. I am. But supposing I'm also vaccinated, can I wear, I don't know, an armband, get a tattoo on my forehead or something that would then allow me to go about my business normally? Should we have this kind of, should we be moving, rationally to medical apartheid so at least some people can have their freedoms back?
Well, I think so. There's two answers. So one answer is we don't actually know. It's probable, almost certain, that having the vaccine will stop transmission. We don't actually know that. So in terms of a collective problem where you're, where you yourself are a risk.
Well, let's find that out in Liverpool and then roll out my suggestion.
I don't want to annoy anyone in Liverpool.
You're on the wrong programme.
I'm sorry I picked on them. So that's an issue. There's another issue, which is these things aren't perfect. So, it's not like you've got a complete ticket to ride. I suspect, actually, you say it'll offend your civil libertarian principles. I suspect you'll end up finding there's a free market solution to this, such as if you wish to go abroad, be an anti-vaxxer, but you're not going abroad. And I suspect there might be other sort of voluntary things that come in. I think it unlikely that there'd be some kind of national vaccine passport situation, but we might just find it coming in ad hoc.
Okay. And Said, what's your take on this? I mean, we tend to be kind of sort of federalist leaning sort of people, at least in concept here at the IEA, that let local people make local decisions. Tom rightly points out that, obviously if you have completely different rules street by street, it's pretty unlikely you're going to defeat the problem, or household by household. But do you think there could have been more federal devolution here, more, or does that kind of defeat the very nature of the bloody problem you're trying to solve? Because then everybody just goes to the open areas and then spreads back to the closed areas.
I think particularly at the beginning, on the early lockdowns, when people were wondering when to open garden centres, for example, there could have been a lot of sort of, the discovery process, local experimentation. If there's an area with a low R rate, let's open the garden centres there. Let's look at the reactions there. And does that raise the R rate? I think I think we should have seen a lot more local experimentation and competition in that way at early stage. But it depends. You know, it depends at what stage we're at. At this stage, I do sympathise with what Tom is saying. The fact that people can freely travel, and especially if you've got a vaccine. But there might be a free market answer. The answer might well be if you wish to travel, you need to have the vaccine and be tested. And that's what the airlines do.
Too many state socialists on this show, so thank God we're now joined by Terry Kibbe, the wonderful Terry Kibbe, co-founder and chief executive officer of the Washington-based Free the People. Terry, welcome. Lovely to have you back.
Hey, Mark, thank you so much.
I'm involved. You're going to be on my side on this one. I'm involved in a pretty passionate argument here against Tom Whipple, my cousin, who's the science editor of the Times newspaper, and my very own academic and research director, Saeed Kamal.
We have no corporate view.
We have no corporate. Well, that much is now pretty bloody clear to anybody who's watching on YouTube. Terry, we were discussing about whether different areas of the country here in the UK, but the same would apply to the United States of America as well, could take different lines on this, different approaches. So here maybe Manchester could choose to take a different approach to London. I guess maybe Virginia could take a different approach to the District of Columbia. I mean, all of that usually in public policy sounds great for people who like sort of small government and the discovery process. Is it practical? And by the way, lovely to see you again, and a very, very Merry Christmas to you. How are you?
I'm good. Merry Christmas to you, Mark. I'm with you on this topic. I think that localism is the only way to make these decisions. A bureaucrat in Washington or a bureaucrat in Westminster, they don't know what is best for the rest of the world, right? I mean, and if you take New York State, what makes sense for New York City doesn't make sense for upstate New York, where there's a much less dense population. Not that I'm condoning any of the lockdowns that they've implemented in New York City, because I think it's a disaster. But I think that in this case, you can't have top-down bureaucracy, or in anything. Top-down bureaucracy is always a bad idea.
But then how would you sort of police that? I mean, let's just imagine, for example, that the District of Columbia said, everything's open, help yourself, go out drinking, hug, kiss, make love, go to pop concerts. And Virginia said, well, hang on one cotton picking minute. We're not sure that quite works for us. Right. And unfortunately, unless you policed the Virginia-DC border, you would leave Virginia's local, more stricter decision at not just at a colossal disadvantage, making it actually unenforceable, right? Unless you actually impose the borders.
Right, and I mean, that's happening now. I mean, Virginia does have very different restrictions from the District of Columbia. And to me, it makes sense. There have been cases, New York City, for example, was saying that they were going to be stopping people on the bridge. They were going to be stopping cars, making sure that you had a negative test for COVID. It's all insane. And I think it really should come down to personal preference. I mean, if you are compromised in any way, then stay home and take care of yourself. If you are healthy and are willing to take the risk to go out, then do it. I mean, everyone needs to be responsible, but there is a certain level of self-preservation and self-decisions here.
But then, Terry, isn't the problem there as well? It's not just about yourself. It's not just whether you're at risk. It's whether, I mean, I might not be at risk, but if it so happens that the 19 people who live in my house are all 83-year-old asthmatics with type 2 diabetes, then me going out for a drink because the council down the road allows me to is a risk to them. That's the problem for us libertarians, right? It's an other regarding activity.
Right. But again, you take it to you look at your personal preferences, and you look at what's happening in your household. I mean, your 83-year-old asthmatic grandmother probably isn't going to be going out to the pub. Actually, I take that back. If she's your grandmother, she probably will be. But for the most part, they're not, right? So people who are compromised are staying home and taking care of themselves. And so people who are healthy should be able to, and who are at lower risk of severe complications, should be allowed to go out and go to work and make a living so that they can take care of the people who are more susceptible.
Cool. Terry, I'm going to come back to you in a minute because we're going to move on to November, in which you guys held an election, I gather. I mean, it takes you like December, January and other months to actually work out who won it, apparently. But Tom, I'm going to come back to you before I wish you a very Merry Christmas. I'd like to know what your New Year, we asked our guests for a New Year's revolution, what you would like to see change in 2021. But as you know, Tom, I also want your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer for the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, frankly, you'd be measuring on a very different sort of nexus to me. So, you know, what's optimistic for me is probably hell for you. But the measurement is how free and prosperous will the United Kingdom be as a country in 2 to 3 years' time, where 10 is utopia has been reached and 0 is we are North Korea.
So yes, as I say, I do struggle with your axis. I am moderately depressed about how prosperous we're going to be. I think we're going to be a lot freer than now. I mean, this is a very temporary crisis. I'm going to stick with my 6. One thing I am optimistic more long term about is that I think we've had as mild a pandemic as it is conceivable to have, while still. But most of these arguments have been about the fact that, you know, it is just on the cusp of something we need to respond to. And I think that's probably quite a good warning and wake up for the world, so that we do this a heck of a lot better next time.
And you have a New Year's revolution for us.
My New Year's revolution is a new proper global health infrastructure. I think it's highly likely we're going to have some sort of Bretton Woods of COVID. And decide that we will have proper global surveillance and reporting rules, a World Health Organization with a bit of teeth, and hopefully some sort of mechanism for picking these things up a lot faster, and perhaps even shaming countries that don't behave properly.
You're pretty confident we can export the centralised NHS model to the world at large. It'll be like being the British Empire again. Could be fantastic, right? Can't see what could go wrong.
I actually mean merely Public Health England at large. So Chris Snowden will love that.
Yeah, Chris will be watching this spitting teeth. Tom, it's been absolutely lovely to see you. Thanks for joining us again. Thanks for being on the show so many times over the recent.
Briefly compliment your outfit. You look like some sort of late '90s backing singer for the Pogues. It's fabulous.
That was just the look I was going for. The IA team got me this bloody hat from somewhere. It's that preposterous. I'm taking, and then told me I had to wear festive clothing, red and white festive clothing. I've only got a Southampton scarf and a Southampton shirt, right? That's the only red and white material I actually own. So that's about as festive as I can get. Tom, lovely to see you. And I hope we can meet for a proper drink before too long. It's been great to have you on the program. Love to you and yours and all the family. And see you again very, very soon. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, November. Treason plots, all that sort of stuff. That's what we say on this side of the pond. Anyway, well, as I was mentioning to Terry, there was a presidential election apparently in the US. I certainly witnessed the campaign, and the election itself was extraordinary. Only on Monday, after weeks of accusation, recrimination, legal threats, seems that Joe Biden's place in the White House was finally confirmed, or the Electoral College voted for him. I don't know if that's the end of the matter. Terry, I'm asking all my American guests this now. Here in the UK, we vote on a Thursday. Polls close at 10 o'clock. By 3 o'clock in the morning, you know who's won. 5 hours. If it's really close, you might have to wait till 6 o'clock in the morning. The Queen has usually appointed the Prime Minister by lunchtime the next day. Done and dusted. Less than 24 hours from polls closing to job done. What the hell's going on in the land of the free and the home of the brave? It takes you forever. What kind of inefficiencies have been racking your constitutional system?
Well, I mean, I have to blame the post office to start with. Mail this entire year has been ridiculously slow. I just got a donation to Free the People that came in last week, and the check was dated and postmarked in August. So for all we know, there are still ballots being out there. This year was particularly messy because so many people were afraid to come out to the polls and did mail-in ballots. And so that just created just a huge backlog. And in many cases, in previous elections, there haven't been that many mail-in ballots, and the numbers aren't that close. So in some cases, the number of mail-in ballots wouldn't even make a difference in the election. So in previous years, they weren't counted. But this year, they had millions of ballots that had to be counted by hand. And then, of course, you know, Donald Trump protested and had called for recounts. And in some cases, the numbers were so close that there had to be recalls. I mean, when you have an election decided by less than 100 votes, there does need to be a recount because mistakes do happen.
I'm not buying any part of this at all. Like, we have postal service in the United Kingdom. I vote by post. My ballot arrives. I sign a form. I send it off. Takes probably less than 2 days to arrive. What the hell's going wrong with your postal service? Secondly, we count everything by hand in the United Kingdom. I think there's no machine tallies at all. The postal ballots are opened. They're verified to make sure they're right. Then they go into the main pot. We recount areas that are close. Sure. I can remember about 15 years ago, the Liberal Democrats won a seat against the Conservatives, Winchester, by 2 votes. And they were wanting to move to another recount, but they couldn't move to, this is so English and quaint, they couldn't move to another recount because the town hall that they were counting in had been booked for a wedding. The whole bloody
very,
thing.
very British.
And we'll say, well, that's going to have to do that. He's won by 2 votes. They did actually rerun that election, but that was 1/650th, right? In most areas, people were clearly winning. You can recount if you're within a percentage or two. It's just people in sports halls and town halls counting ballots and piling them up. We don't have, like you, we don't have a complex electoral system, right? You put a cross in a box, it counts. It all looks pretty extraordinary. And do you think that the problem here is that partisanship's just so high, you were never going to get losers' consent? That whoever lost was bound to say the other side's cheated, right? Had Donald Trump prevailed, the Democrats would have said this was broken, this was bust, or whatever.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, tempers were high, emotions were high. It was going to be contested either way. But if you look at the state of Georgia, they're having a runoff election on January 5th. Congress is sworn in on January 3rd, and we don't know who the senators from the state of Georgia will be yet until after the swearing in of the
Just
senators.
explain that to us, our old-fashioned Brits who live in a monarchy. What's a runoff election? This is for the Senate positions in Georgia.
It's for the 2 Senate positions. And
why are they having this out of cycle? Why wasn't that all sorted out?
So it happened. So there was the election there on November, whatever it was. It seems like years ago. But neither of the candidates got over 50%. So in the state of Georgia, that automatically requires another vote. So they're going to the polls again in January. And so that's why control of the Senate hinges now on Georgia, if Republicans need to win both of those seats to keep control of the Senate.
Wow. Okay. Saeed, what do you make of this? Are you a fan of British democracy? Sorry, I'm being a bit cruel to Terry, but
you are. Yeah, you are.
But I mean, are you a fan of British democracy or the kind of subpar American version?
Hold on a minute, come on. Well, my parents are US citizens, as you know, so I'm a fan of both. I find both systems fascinating. Sorry about that. I apologise. I know that's not the answer you wanted.
But it's quite a long process in the States, isn't it? Because even if it's an election in which the result is not in doubt, the period of time between the vote and taking office, when's Joe Biden become president? January the 21st?
January 20th, right.
January the 20th. So, I mean, this is 2.5 months between. I guess it's because they've got separation of powers and all of that stuff. And what do you make of it, Terry? I'm hoping that you were going to tell me that you've launched a campaign that is bound to prevail in the Supreme Court to announce that Jo Jorgensen is in fact the winner and we have our first Libertarian Party president.
Are you ever going to let me live down the fact that I supported Jo Jorgensen?
No, so did I. I think I'd probably vote for the Libertarian Party in the States. But I guess what I'm saying from a libertarian perspective, what do you make of the result? Let's assume that Biden becomes the president.
Right.
The Republican Party's performed probably, given that, rather better in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. What should we make of the likely public policy coming from the federal government in the years ahead? And because we're so centralized here in the UK, we only tend to look at the federal government in America, right? What's coming out of DC.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting election result. It's the first time ever in the history of the United States that the incumbent president actually got more popular votes for re-election and still lost. The turnout was incredible. Trump got 71 million votes, Biden got 80 million. But what is the most interesting to me about the results is that usually people go in and they vote the party line. They vote all Republican, they vote all Democrat, and usually the top of the ticket in a presidential race carries through. But in this case, that didn't happen. The Republicans actually had a much better results than they would have expected with Trump losing. I mean, they picked up seats in the House. I mean, the Senate is still up for grabs. For me, the best outcome, and not that I think that the two Republicans running for the Senate in Georgia are particularly good, but for me, the best outcome is for them to win and the Republicans to keep the Senate. Because as a libertarian, I like divided government, and I think that gridlock is the best thing for the country because it just means that less bad things will get passed.
Okay, well, Terry, you might think that you had more at stake in the US presidential race than me and my friends here in England, but I'm going to prove you wrong by bringing on a new guest to the show. This is somebody who had something pretty goddamn serious at stake in the US presidential election and lost. Madeline Grant from the Telegraph and once of this parish. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well, thank you, Mark. How are you?
I'm not too bad at all. We had the person you placed the bet with on earlier in the show. You placed a very, very big bet that Donald Trump would be re-elected, and you lost.
I did, yes. Well,
and the consequence, Terry won't know this story. Some of our viewers at the top of the show will. The consequence of losing, this was James and Madeline, Terry, and people watching who don't know the story, rather than placing a cash bet, which would be the sensible free market thing to do, placed a very personal bet. What was the bet, Maddie?
Well, a bit of context here. This was quite a long time before the pandemic, when he was riding very high in the polls, the economy was booming, and the wokeists in America were busy, burning everything in sight. So it really did look as if he had a very good chance of winning. But even
so you bought shares in Trump at the wrong time. I get that. Yep.
Then I got a bit drunk with James and decided
this I can't believe that never happened. Surely.
And then we thought it would be really funny to set a bet where, depending on whether Trump or Biden won, one of us would have to add a new middle name to our and the middle name was Waluigi, who is a character from the Mario series and Nintendo. Don't ask me why. And I've gone ahead with it, did the deed poll. It's been signed and witnessed by James. And I'm going to have to renew my passport next year. So it'll be blue, but it will also have the name Waluigi in it.
So you're now Madeline Waluigi Grant.
No, actually, you keep your original middle name. So it's Madeline Mary Waluigi Grant.
Oh, well, that's so much better. I can see why you're so much more relaxed about it. Okay, and what do you make of what's happened on the other side of the pond, Maddie? I mean, Terry was just sort of saying, obviously, it depends what happens in Georgia a bit, but they have a much more balance of power, separation of powers position. So you could have a Democrat president. Obviously, the House of Representatives will be Democrat, but if the Senate is in GOP hands, then it's kind of, politicians can stop each other, which doesn't seem to happen so much here in the UK.
No, quite the opposite. It's amazing how quickly they've reached for the executive powers and how quickly the transformation took place in this country. When you can get to a stage where people are determining whether individuals can leave their homes by kind of fiat without any of the proper parliamentary procedure. I mean, I don't know enough about America to comment on what the procedure there has been like. But I mean, I don't follow American politics particularly closely. Hang
on, you gambled your name on this. Perhaps you should follow it a bit more closely in future, Maddie.
Yeah, I mean, that is you do make a good point, but that's the trouble with drink, you see, that we're not thinking rationally when we think that 50.
But there needs to be a government program to stop this, probably ban alcohol advertising, that kind of thing, yeah.
Well, quite.
Ban private bets.
My feeling towards the Trump-Biden was always that, I think normally I probably would vote for the Republicans, but I thought it'd be good for the Republican Party to get rid of Trump so they can actually have a proper free market Republican who values freedom and the values that make that a great party. So I always thought it'd be worth them losing. If anything, I would have liked Trump to have lost a bit more so that the Trump element would be kind of firmly out of the Republican Party for good and they could get somebody sensible in.
Saeed, where were you on this? I mean, obviously here at the IEA, we need to keep our eye on party politics because we're part of the public policy debate, but we're not partisan. I found Biden, Trump a pretty unedifying choice. Similarly with Clinton, Trump, actually. But do you think the Americans are onto something by having different votes for different things? I mean, we had Graham Brady on the IEA London channel not so long ago, the chairman of the Conservative Backbench Committee, who actually thinks the Prime Minister should be elected a bit like the American president. He wouldn't exactly take that system, but that we should elect the executive differently to the legislature. Whereas at the moment we have the legislature, which the executive is therefore taken from that. And then people in the legislature are climbing that greasy pole. You know, it'd be as if the equivalent in Terry's homeland would be if only senators could be cabinet ministers or hold executive office. Do you think we got something to learn from the US system side?
I'm not sure, but I think really what happens is that these systems evolve that suit the country. And I know there was a constitution that set up these checks and balances, at the beginning, and that worked. Whereas our much longer tradition evolved over time, and we couldn't suddenly, I think, artificially change it now. Though there have been attempts, particularly when we're in the EU and EU-inspired attempts to change our constitution. But I think they work well for their countries. I like the American system, for the US. I like the checks and balances. The other thing I do like about it, I think, particularly in terms of the pure politics of the election, if you think about the time Clinton won the election and you had a Republican Senate, that worked well. That was and because Clinton had to triangulate. Biden, in this case, one of my former staffers went to work for Biden, and he said to me, "Son, you've got to recognise in Britain, Biden would probably be a conservative politician." And so a lot of those Republicans that Maddie was talking about that were uncomfortable with Trump and probably held their nose and voted for Trump out of party loyalty, actually, whereas they would never have voted for Hillary, felt relatively more comfortable voting for Biden, also with the same wish that actually Trump would go and they could get their party back.
Okay, yeah, maybe. Well, I mean, I'm glad, unless Terry tells me otherwise, has the likelihood of an American Civil War receded for the time being, Terry?
Yes, there will be no civil war as far as I can tell. And I will be perfectly honest with you. We were traveling on election night. We actually went down to Texas to go to the Joe Jorgensen election night party. And before we left, I mean, we lived 2 blocks from the US Capitol, and not knowing what was going to happen, we boarded up our windows because we were ready. We didn't want to have to worry about the house while we were gone. But that threat has gone. I think, there's still going to be protests and demonstrations here and there. Just this weekend, there was another gathering in the city, but I think it's calmed down. I don't really think that there will be another civil war.
Well, that's good to know. And if you wanted a centrist president, at least in terms of the course of American history, well, you've got one. Joe Biden. Right. Joe Biden was actually born closer to the American Civil War, 77 years afterwards, than he was to today. 78 years since he was born. He was born slightly closer to the American Civil War than he was today. There you go. There's a good little fact to go away with. Look, let's move on to December. Then we can wrap the year. I'm not sure we're going to be wrapping it on a high note. And now Terry can get her own back. If it takes you a long time to work out who your president is, that is as nothing compared to whether we're a member of the European Union or not. This has now taken 4 years and counting. The 11th hour of the 11th hour, we're still rowing about fish with the European Union. We're still rowing about the level playing field. We don't know whether there's going to be a deal. We're out totally on 1st of January, deal or no deal, I think, unless there's another goddamn extension. What on earth is going on here? This makes a US presidential election look like it passes in a millisecond. And I just saw Ursula von der Leyen today saying the next few days will be decisive. Well, what the bloody hell's happened in the last 4 years? Maddie, where the hell are we at here? I think you were in favour of Brexit, but I mean, this is a generational battle with no end in sight, right?
It's extraordinary. I thought some of my last minute excuses for late work at university were bad, but it just keeps being pushed back, can kicking after can kicking. And the thing is, we're kind of living for some weeks, in fact, I think we've been living in a kind of alternate universe where everyone has to kind of pretend that the next extension deadline and the next through rounds of kind of final hour negotiations means something, but we all know that this is another fake deadline, another can kicking down the road. And I do think that, you know, there have been some signs of movement in the last 24 hours or so, but you know, we've heard all of that before. I think what this last few weeks have really brought out to me, somebody who did vote for Brexit. I mean, I was surprised by how difficult it's been. I assumed that it would be easier than this to get a deal. Perhaps a bit too complacent on that front, but it has really underlined to me some of the reasons why I voted to leave. The fact that the inflexibility of the EU on certain points, and also the way in which their position on some key issues has shifted. There's been a moving of the goalposts. They've gone back on assurances that they were made to negotiate in good faith towards a trade deal, and specifically a kind of Canada-style deal. So I think there has been some moving of the goalposts. Of course, many of the ardent Remainers in Britain will only see this as Britain's fault and complacency. But I think there really has to be, if there's a failure of statecraft here, there's been a heck of a lot of it on the EU side too. And I don't think that's gone unnoticed by the British public.
Well, we also had this litigation problem, the absence of losers' consent, right? I mean, I can't remember who was on the program earlier. Alex Deane was earlier saying, look, if you're going to live in a democracy, you've got to move on when the decision's made. You just can't keep revisiting it. Some you win, some you lose, or in the case of Southampton Arsenal tonight, some you draw. Terry, what's the view of Brexit from across the pond? Because one of the big upsides, supposedly, for us was that certainly under the Trump administration, I think people are more cautious about the Biden administration, we'd go for Brexit. We had a government here that was not simpatico with the Trump administration, had a sort of working partnership, UK-US trade deal, kind of what you've lost on the EU roundabout, you've won on the US horses. Unfortunately, it took us the entirety of the Trump administration to argue with the French about fish. So here we find ourselves with a new administration because we spent so much time talking about fish. How are you guys in the US seeing this? Or perhaps you're just not seeing it at all. This is just a sort of rather pathetic domestic problem in the motherland.
So what you're saying is that all of these problems are really France's fault?
Yeah. I mean, that's there's probably a paragraph or two after that, but that's usually the answer. That's roughly the sort of headlines that Maddie uses in the Telegraph. And,
right, of course. Well, Carrie Hardy from Paris is sitting here in studio with me, so I had to take the opportunity. But Mark, back to your actual question. I mean, I've been following Brexit, and I mean, I was a supporter of it. I think you're picking on me for my elections lasting 3 months, and you can't get this done in 4 years. I mean, I've been following it closely, but I don't think unfortunately, most people in the United States, if you polled them today, they wouldn't really remember what Brexit was all about. I mean, we've really been focusing. Most of America they always focus inward. So we've been focusing on the race riots and the election and just all of the inner turmoil. And unfortunately, people haven't been paying much attention. I do believe that you're going to have a much harder road now with Biden in office for as long as he stays there until Kamala becomes president. But I think it's going to be a challenge for you guys. I think, wasn't the quote something like, you're going to have to get to the back of the line? Didn't Obama say that? Yeah. And Biden is just
back of the queue. He used the English vernacular.
That's true. He did use queue.
That's how we know that Number 10 Downing Street wrote his speech rather than the White House press corps. Two nations divided by the same language.
Of course. So unfortunately, people here aren't paying attention. They're too focused on partisan.
No, I don't blame you. Why would you pay attention? I mean, my parents were in the United States of America when the Brexit vote came in, and they were amazed that it and David Cameron's resignation was actually the top news story of the day. A friend of mine was previously there in the 1992 general election, where the re-election of the British Conservative government, I think, was the 6th news story after cat stuck up tree. Saeed, let me finish with you and wrap up. I'd like your thoughts on the US-UK relationship. Let's assume this change of administration goes through. It looks like it will. Where does that leave how free market liberals like you and I should be thinking about trade and the transatlantic relationship? Is this a step back, or is there a pathway to easing the frictions in present US-UK trade? And Saeed, what's your optimism index number for the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Plan A Plus of the IA publication where it talked about these trade negotiations post Brexit being like multi-dimensional chess. And it's going to be, if there is no deal between the EU and UK, it's going to be more difficult to get a trade deal with the US.
You think more? I would say less.
Sorry?
If there isn't a trade deal with the EU,
yes, it'll be more difficult for the UK to get a trade deal with the US. Yes, it will be.
This is yet another thing you and I disagree about.
Yeah, of course. Look, Biden has said quite clearly.
Does anybody listen to me in this bloody building?
Just remember, we have no corporate view. Because Biden has really, Biden, because of his Irish heritage, has been sympathetic to the EU. I remember when I was in the European Parliament and he came, he made a special effort to come and visit the European Parliament as vice president. And he's one of those people who thinks it's easier to pick up the phone to Europe. Who are you going to call? Let's just call. They want. I mean, don't forget, Obama was accused of wanting the US to be more like Europe, if you remember all those years ago. And so, effectively, what he said is, don't even think about a UK-US deal unless you've signed an EU-UK deal. So it will be more difficult. And at the same time, let's not forget, Trump said all the lovely words, but he could have done a deal with those 4 years. He didn't. He was going to be a tough negotiator, despite those warm words, and he was going to be tough. And the reason it's going on for so long, I knew it would go on for a long time, because what had happened, because we had negotiated so badly first time round, Barnier had set the terms of negotiations. He separated withdrawal from the new agreement rather than doing them in parallel. Because he had done that, he effectively almost locked us into a customs union. And what David Frost has had to do as a chief negotiator for the UK is actually go to brinkmanship, be really tough, and give them the impression that we're prepared to walk away. And you compromise right at the very last minute, squeeze as much as you could. And that's what he's had to do. And he's overplayed the fishing or the bargaining chip, excuse the pun about fish and chips, but he's overplayed the that bargaining chip, because that's one of the few real strong bargaining chips we had to make sure that we kept the EU at the table.
Well, great. That's cheered me up, no bloody end, Saeed. What's your out of 10 optimism score then? Given it looks like the Europeans have abandoned us, Terry and Americans have abandoned us. It's just me, you, and Maddie Nintendo girl.
Oh, come on, Mark.
We're going to be propping
what
up
do we
Britain
tell people? It's not countries that trade with each other. It's people and businesses in one country that trade with people and businesses in another country for mutual benefit. There are lots of people, companies and individuals who trade with the US, and there is no trade deal. You don't need a trade deal to trade. Yes,
but you want trade barriers removed, though.
Yes,
right?
Of course you want trade barriers removed, but then entrepreneurs do make those calculations, don't they? And they still think that they can make a profit despite that. They either absorb the costs or they, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. You've had this book. Now, tell me what the scale is, because you keep changing what 0 to 10 is. Is it about optimism about the EU? Is it optimism about a libertarian utopia?
No. It's how freedom and prosperous do you think the United Kingdom will be in about 2 to 3 years' time?
Mark, I think
I sometimes allow guests who are not from the United Kingdom to apply this to the Western world or Europe.
Mark, you and I are dreamers. We fight for libertarian utopia, but actually we know that the battle for liberty is never over, and we have to continually fight for it. I think Britain is basically a kind of social democratic wet Tory country. And if we're not fighting for liberty all the time, then the needle shifts to left wing. So I think what happens is that, I never think we're going to be this libertarian utopia, but I think we have to fight for a classical liberal ideas and a classical liberal society, because we have to keep fighting for that freedom. But I think we're going to end up with something like 5 or 6.
One number.
One
number.
5.5? No,
6. One number. The rules are so goddamn clear. Give me.
You didn't say it.
It's an integer.
You didn't say it.
Saying, well, 2 weeks ago I would have given you an 8 or a 9, and now I'll give you a 3 or a 4. Give me one number. 6. Maddie, where are you on this? Madeline. I can't remember what. Madeline Nintendo character Grant. You've got to be feeling.
Well, Luigi.
Yeah.
Well, Luigi, thank you, Saeed. I'm probably quite similar to Saeed in the sense that I think the consensus in politics now is not going in our direction. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and probably be totally wrong in my prediction, as I was with the US election and my new name, and say a 6, which for me is optimistic if you remember some of my earlier scores. I think, firstly, the vaccination coming here sooner is a brilliant thing. And the fact that we were able to do that sooner is a great reminder of why we're better off out of the EU, because it shows how the extent to which that precautionary based thinking is dominating within the EU leadership. So there is that. The second thing that I'm really excited about next year is the prospect of Britain welcoming in hundreds of thousands of enterprising Hong Kong residents to the UK. I think that could be an absolutely game-changing thing and a wonderful reminder, and welcomes so many of these enterprising, ambitious people. I think that would be a brilliant thing. There's that. There's also the fact that every time you wake up, Liz Truss has signed another trade deal. She seems to, I don't know how she does it. Does she sleep? It's a good question. So I think there is a lot to be excited about next year. And I'm hoping that the mindset in the population, I mean, obviously people have really reached for the state in a big way during the pandemic. And to a worrying degree, I think many people seem totally incapable of assessing their own levels of risk and so on. But I do think that it will also prompt a conversation about how we manage key things such as the NHS, which were previously off limits in discussion. People will now start to say, well, why can't we be more like Germany? Because Germany managed the pandemic better. So I think that we will now actually have a more honest conversation about some of these sacred cows. So perhaps I'm slightly more optimistic. That might also be that I plan to get a cat next year, which is something I'm very excited about. So I think
bang! That's got to be worth 2 points alone. That's got to be worth 2 points alone.
So it was 4 before.
Yeah. So what number are you giving me?
6.
6. Another 6. Okay. Terry, you can apply this to the Western world in general, I guess, right?
So I was a little depressed coming into this call, but since I've been sitting here for a while, I'm on my 3rd glass of champagne, so I'm feeling a little bit more of the holiday spirit.
That's worth more than Maddie's cat. That's
Absolutely.
got to be worth 3 points.
So I'm going to go with an 8, actually. Yes. So I think the next year is going to be tough, but I think we're going to get through it. And if we, as in groups like the IEA and Free the People, and we all keep doing our jobs and fighting for freedom and liberty, we'll get past some of these draconian lockdowns and hopefully end up with a freer world.
Well, guys, that's a 6, an 8. I'm going to be a 7. I would have been an 8, but Southampton were 1-0 up and only finished up 1-1, and Arsenal were down to 10 men. And at half time, we were top of the Premier League, and that's not something you often see. So that's knocked a point off, and I'm not getting a cat. But and I haven't had 3 glasses of champagne, but I have had 3 beers. That's only worth half a point. It's not as good as Terry's champagne. But Saeed, Terry, Maddie, thank you for joining us this evening for this review of the year. Thank you for being guests on this show over its 25 episodes so far. I wish you a very, very Merry Christmas, a safe, but at least as importantly, a free New Year. Thanks to the 3 of you for joining us. Been lovely having you. Thanks to our earlier guests, Kate Andrews, James Price, Matthew Elliott, Patrick Basham, Mike Graham, Brendan O'Neill, Christian Nemitz, Len Shackleton, Maya Tusi, Alex Deane, Christopher Snowden, Matt Kilcoyne, Tom Harwood, and Tom Whipple. Just before I go, quick advertisement. I'm back at 6 o'clock tomorrow night to introduce our first ever virtual Hayek lecture, an annual lecture, but tomorrow it will be virtual. The world after the pandemic. The brilliant Dr. Stephen Davies will look back into the past to work out what we can learn about now and the future and tell us what history can tell us about the world after the pandemic. It will be fascinating viewing, and there'll be a chance to put your questions directly to him after the lecture. That's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. right here on the IEA London YouTube channel. And if you're in the 99% of Brits, or indeed anywhere else in the world who's not allowed to go down the pub or a restaurant, and you've got some downtime or lockdown time over Christmas and the festive period, why not take part in a chance not to win 50 quid of my measly money, but to win £50,000 of Richard Koch's money that he's put on the table for the winner of this year's Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize. This is to look for the best pro-enterprise, pro-market policies to help the left behind areas of the United Kingdom. And you can find all of the details at breakthroughprize.org.uk. Many thanks for watching this evening. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it the thumbs up. Please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you're feeling generous at Christmas time, we would love to welcome you on board as a donor. Go to the iea.org.uk website and give whatever you can. If you can help us in financially in any way at all, that would be appreciated. Thanks to all of our donors who have done so. We're taking a Christmas break now, but we'll be back at 6 o'clock UK time on January the 13th. Until then, have a very, very Merry Christmas, an optimistic and happy New Year. Stay safe, stay free, enjoy yourself. Over and out.